porcelain cup hit the wall at exactly 9:30 in the morning, and every servant on the ground floor of Ashbourne Estate heard it shatter. No one moved. Not the footman standing near the east corridor. Not the young kitchen girl who had just come up the stairs with a basket of fresh linens. Not even Mrs. Drummond, the head housekeeper, who had been working in this grand house for nearly 14 years and had heard this sound more times than she cared to count. They all simply stopped what they were doing, held their breath, and waited. The silence that followed the crash was always worse than the crash itself. Inside the tall-ceilinged study at the end of the main corridor, Edmund Harrogate, the 6th Duke of Ashbourne, stood with his back to the door and his eyes fixed on the garden below. The cup he had thrown was one of a set of 12, imported from France at considerable expense by his father. He did not think about that. He did not think about much in these moments. He only felt the hot, tight pressure behind his eyes, the way his jaw ached from clenching, and the deep, familiar sensation that everything around him was pressing in too close, too loud, too much. He was 41 years old. He had inherited this estate at 19, had managed it through drought and flood and the deaths of tenants who had worked the land longer than he had been alive. He had sat in Parliament, argued with ministers, and negotiated terms with men twice his age, who had tried to take advantage of his youth. He had buried his father, then his mother, and then, 7 years ago, his wife. He had done all of this without weeping, without collapsing, without letting anyone see the interior of him. What he had done instead was this. He had shouted. He had slammed doors. He had thrown things. He had driven away, in 11 years, more household staff than most estates employed in a generation. It was not something he was proud of. It was simply something he did not know how to stop. The estate of Ashbourne sat in the valley between two low hills in the northern English countryside, about 3 miles from the nearest village. It was a beautiful place, in the way that very old things that have survived many difficulties are beautiful. The stone walls had been built in 1643, and had held through every storm since. The gardens, which stretched out behind the main house in long ordered rows of hedges and rose bushes, had been maintained by the same family of groundskeepers for 4 generations. The house itself had 31 rooms, 11 fireplaces, and a library that contained over 4,000 books, most of which had not been opened in 20 years. The villagers knew the estate primarily by its reputation, and its reputation was not entirely flattering. They said the Duke was difficult. They said he was cold. They said the servants never stayed because the pay was poor and the atmosphere impossible. This last part was not quite accurate. The Duke paid fair wages. The atmosphere was the problem. Mrs. Agnes Drummond had stayed because she was a practical woman who did not frighten easily and who had developed, over many years, a method of managing the Duke's moods the way a careful gardener manages difficult weather. She did not engage with him during a storm. She did not apologize to him when it was not her fault. She simply waited, kept the house running, and relied on the fact that the man always calmed down eventually, always became quieter and more civil by evening, and never, to his credit, held a grudge once the moment had passed. But staff who had not been there long enough to understand this pattern simply left. And so the house cycled through footmen and maids and undercooks with exhausting regularity, and Mrs. Drummond spent a considerable portion of her life interviewing replacements. It was on a Thursday in early September, 3 years before the events that would change Ashbourne forever, that Clara Voss arrived at the servants' entrance. She came on foot, having walked the last mile from the road after the cart that had been taking her in the general direction of the estate turned off toward the mill. She was carrying a brown carpet bag that was not entirely full, and she wore a gray dress and a coat that had been good quality once and was now respectably worn. Her hair was dark and pinned neatly beneath a plain hat. She was 19 years old, and she had the kind of face that people sometimes found difficult to read, not because she was hiding anything, but because she was simply paying more attention to what was in front of her than to how she appeared to others. She knocked at the servants' door 3 times, evenly spaced, and waited. Mrs. Drummond opened it herself, because the current kitchen girl had gone to the village, and the footman was occupied with the coal delivery. She looked Clara up and down with the trained eye of a woman who had been making quick judgments about people her entire working life, and what she saw was not particularly alarming. The girl was small, neat, and composed. She did not fidget. She met Mrs. Drummond's eyes without aggression or false brightness. "Clara Voss?" Mrs. Drummond said, though she knew perfectly well who it was. She had received the letter from the vicar in Wendham 2 days ago. "Yes," Clara said. "Good morning, Mrs. Drummond." "Come in, then. Mind the step." Clara stepped over the worn stone threshold and stood in the servants' hall, taking in the space around her with quiet attention. It was a long room with a low ceiling, smelling of bread and coal smoke and the particular mixture of soap and stone that old houses always carry. There was a long wooden table down the center, with benches on either side. The walls were whitewashed and hung with a few practical items: a clock, a board with hooks for keys, a list of daily duties written in someone's careful hand. It was clean and functional, and gave nothing away about whether the people who worked here were happy or not. "Sit down," Mrs. Drummond said, gesturing to the bench near the table. She sat opposite and placed her hands flat on the surface with the air of a woman who had conducted a great many interviews and found most of them tedious. "You come from Wyndham." "From the farms outside it," Clara said. "My father keeps a tenant holding, 40 acres, mostly sheep. The vicar speaks well of you. He says you have strong character and a calm temperament." "I think he means I am not excitable," Clara said. Mrs. Drummond's eyebrow went up slightly. The girl had said it without the faintest trace of either pride or apology, simply as an observation, as though she were describing the color of her coat. "Have you worked in a house before?" 2 years at Fenwick Hall, in the valley, under housemaid, then housemaid proper. I left when the family moved to Edinburgh. I have a reference from Mrs. Aldred, the housekeeper there, which I can give you." She reached into the carpet bag and produced a folded letter, which she set on the table with both hands, precisely aligned with the edge. Mrs. Drummond unfolded it and read it in full, which took some time, because Mrs. Aldred had been thorough. When she had finished, she refolded the letter and returned it. "This is a more demanding house than Fenwick Hall," Mrs. Drummond said. "I understood that before I applied." "Did you?" It was not a question. Mrs. Drummond looked at her steadily. "What did you understand, specifically?" Clara was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was selecting the right words. "I understood that the household has a high turnover of staff. I understood that the master of the house has a strong temper. I understood that the work itself is demanding, and that the person best suited to this position would need to be steady and not easily unsettled." Mrs. Drummond said nothing. "I am not easily unsettled," Clara added. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, during which the clock on the wall ticked 8 times, and something banged distantly above them, which was almost certainly a door being closed with considerable force in some upper part of the house. Clara did not look up at the sound. She kept her eyes on Mrs. Drummond. "I will try you for a month," Mrs. Drummond said at last. "You will be under housemaid. You will report to me at 6 each morning. You will not go near the study, the library, or the upper gallery without being asked. You will carry out your duties quietly and competently, and you will not gossip with the other staff about anything relating to the family or to this house. If at the end of 1 month I am satisfied, we will discuss a more permanent arrangement. If I am not satisfied, you will be given 2 weeks' wages and a reference and sent on your way. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear," Clara said. "Good. Then come, and I will show you the room." The room she was given was small but adequate, on the upper servants' floor, with a single window that looked out over the kitchen garden. There was a bed, a chest of drawers, a hook on the wall, and a washstand with a plain white basin and jug. Clara set her bag on the chest of drawers, hung her coat on the hook, and stood for a moment looking out of the window at the rows of beans and late cabbages below. She was not frightened. She was not nervous in the way that many young women in her position might have been. She was simply present, paying attention, taking in what was in front of her. It was a skill she had always had without knowing it was a skill. She had grown up watching her father read weather by the look of the sky and the smell of the air, and she had learned, in the same unthinking way, to read people. What she had gathered in the first 20 minutes at Ashbourne was this: the housekeeper was competent and honest and did not waste words. The house was quiet in a way that was not quite peaceful, the quiet of a place where people moved carefully. And somewhere in the upper rooms, there was a man with a great deal of pain that he did not know what to do with. She did not pity him for this. She did not feel superior. She simply noted it, the way her father noted the direction of wind, and filed it away, and went downstairs to begin her first day's work. The other servants were careful with her at first, in the way that people are careful with someone new when they are also slightly hopeful. There were 6 of them in the household at that time. Mrs. Drummond herself, a cook named Bertha who was heavy-set and warm-natured, and laughed easily when the master was not in earshot. A footman named George who had been there 8 months, and was beginning to develop the hunched quality of someone who has learned to make himself invisible. A kitchen girl named Nell who was 15 and scared of her own shadow. A groom named Patrick who lived above the stables and rarely came inside. And an odd-job man named Henry who was 62, and claimed to have worked at the estate longer than he could remember, which may well have been true. They told her things, carefully and in pieces, over the first few days. George told her about the study, that she was never to enter it without first knocking and then waiting to be asked to come in. Bertha told her about the dining schedule, that the Duke ate breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, and dinner at 7, and that he expected everything to be on time to the minute, and that being late with a meal was one of the things most likely to cause trouble. Nell told her, in a whisper, that she had once seen the Duke shout at a visiting member of the clergy, which had caused a considerable scandal in the village, that the servants were still managing the effects of 2 years later. Henry, who had seen more than any of them, told her nothing directly. But one afternoon, when they happened to be in the garden at the same time and Clara was carrying a basket of cut herbs for Bertha and Henry was mending a low stone wall, he paused in his work and looked at her with the steady, unhurried eyes of a man who has long since stopped being in a rush about anything. "You are still here," he said, with a note of mild approval. "I have been here 4 days," Clara said. "Some of them don't make it that far. I am not some of them." Henry turned back to his wall and fitted a stone into place with careful hands. "No," he said after a moment, "I don't think you are." Clara continued on with her herbs. That evening, she was given the task of carrying the last of the evening post to the study. Mrs. Drummond usually did this herself, but she had a headache, and had asked George, and George had developed a sudden and convenient memory of another task that needed his urgent attention, so the duty had arrived, via a somewhat embarrassed sequence of delegation, with Clara. She took the small stack of letters from the hall table, knocked twice on the study door as she had been instructed, and waited. There was a long pause, then a voice from inside, not shouting, not precisely welcoming either, somewhere between neutral and exhausted, said, "Come in." She opened the door and entered. The study was large, and would have been impressive if it had been tidier. There were bookshelves on 3 of the 4 walls, and most of the shelves held books, but several held papers in varying degrees of disorder, and one held a collection of small objects, stones, fossils, a miniature compass, a broken watch, things that someone had once collected with care, and that now sat undisturbed in dust. There was a heavy oak desk in the center of the room, and behind it sat Edmund Harrogate, Duke of Ashbourne. He was not what she had been expecting, though she would not have been able to say precisely what she had expected. He was tall, she could tell even sitting, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a face that looked like it had once been handsome and was now interesting instead. He was wearing a dark coat that had been well made, and that he had clearly spent a long day in. He had the eyes of a person who slept badly, and had done so for some time. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been confronted with something he was not prepared for, not hostile, simply surprised. "You are the new under-housemaid," he said. "Yes," she said, "I have the evening post." She crossed the room at an even pace, set the letters on the corner of his desk that was clear of papers, and stepped back. He looked at the letters, then at her. "Mrs. Drummond usually brings these. She has a headache this evening." Something moved across his face, not sympathy exactly, but an awareness that other people had physical conditions that affected their availability. It was, she thought, a kind of consideration that he had somewhere, but did not often practice. "Is she well?" "She expects to be better in the morning." "Good." He looked at the letters again. "You may go." "Good evening," Clara said, and left. That was the first conversation. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Nothing remarkable was said, but as Clara walked back down the corridor to the servants' staircase, she turned it over carefully in her mind, the way she turned over everything, looking at it from different angles, noting the details. He had been surprised to see a new face. That meant the turnover of staff unsettled him, even if he did not acknowledge it. He had asked after Mrs. Drummond. That meant he was aware of other people's conditions, at least some of the time. He had not been rude. He had been tired. She did not decide anything that evening. She simply noted what she had seen, and filed it, and went on to her other duties. The month passed, then another. Mrs. Drummond, reviewing her work at the end of the first month with the thoroughness she applied to everything, found nothing to fault. Clara was prompt, competent, methodical, and quiet. She got on reasonably well with the other servants, not in the warm, easy way of someone who makes friends quickly, but in the reliable way of someone who does what she says she will do and does not cause trouble. She was offered a permanent position, and she accepted it, and the arrangement continued. She was still learning Ashbourne. She was learning its rhythms, its patterns, the way a house has a personality as much as a person does. She was learning which floorboards creaked, which windows let in a draft, which rooms got cold on north-facing days. She was learning the Duke's patterns too, because his patterns were part of the house's patterns, and understanding one helped her understand the other. She noticed that he walked in the garden early in the mornings when the weather was clear, alone, moving fast, as though the walking were a way of burning off something that the night had built up. She noticed that he read after dinner, always in the library rather than the study, and that on those evenings he was quieter and more contained than at other times. She noticed that he had particular dislikes, that he could not bear the smell of lavender, which was unfortunate given how much of it Mrs. Drummond used in the linen wash, and that he disliked being spoken to before he had finished his morning coffee, which George had discovered the hard way, and which Clara had simply observed from a safe distance and taken note of. She also noticed what the other servants noticed but discussed in lower voices, that the bad days clustered around Fridays, that the presence of particular items on his desk, reports from London, letters with certain postmarks, seemed to precede the worst of the outbursts, and that even during the worst of them he never once directed his anger at anything living. He threw objects at walls, he slammed doors, he raised his voice at the ceiling, but he did not aim his fury at people, or rather, at the people themselves. The voice, yes, the shout was always present, but in Clara's private accounting, there was a difference between a man who used his anger as a weapon against others and a man who used it as a release valve for something with nowhere else to go. She was not yet sure what to do with this distinction. For now, she simply held it. And she waited, with the patience that was native to her, for the next chapter of what she was beginning to understand was a very long story. The first snow came on a Thursday, early for the season, falling soft and without warning over the valley, and settling on the gardens and the kitchen roof and the gatepost at the long drive's entrance. Clara saw it from the upstairs window while she was changing the linens in one of the guest rooms that no guest ever used, the white sheets in her hands a near match for what was forming outside. The house changed in winter. It became a different place, contained and inward, the fires burning in every room and the stone walls holding the warmth with a kind of determined effort. The smell changed too, more smoke and candle wax and less of the outdoor air that summer let in through every crack. The servants spent more time in the servants' hall in the evenings, gathered around the table with small tasks, mending or polishing or simply sitting, because there was nowhere much else comfortable to be. Clara listened during those evenings more than she spoke. She had always been this way, not shy, not unfriendly, but more interested in what was being said around her than in adding to it, and what was being said, on any given winter evening at Ashbourne, usually came around to the Duke. It was inevitable, she supposed. He was the fact of the house, the reason all of them were there, the central gravity around which all their working lives orbited. You could not work in a place and not talk about it. And he was interesting, in his difficult way, not the way people are interesting when they are pleasant and amusing. The way that difficult, complicated people are interesting when you are close enough to them to see the architecture of their difficulty. Bertha, who had been at Ashbourne for 6 years and who had the longest memory of any of the current staff, was the most willing to talk about the time before the Duke's wife had died, before the house had taken on its present quality, the held breath feeling, the careful movements. It was different then, Bertha said one evening, rolling pastry at the kitchen table while Nell washed dishes and Henry sat near the fire mending a harness, and Clara sat opposite with a pile of stockings that needed darning. She had a way with him, not that he was easy, mind, he was never easy, but she could manage him. She'd get in front of it before it got too bad. What was she like? Clara asked. Small, Bertha said, pressing the rolling pin down firmly. Fair, with these pale green eyes. Quiet in her way, but not soft. She had opinions. She wasn't frightened to say them either. A pause. She and the Duke used to argue. Proper arguments. Voices raised and everything. But it was different to the way he is now. She'd argue back, you see. He couldn't get to that place he goes to now when there was someone matching him. And when she died, Clara said. When she died, there was no one to match him, and he didn't know how to go anywhere else. Bertha shook her head slowly, more sad than anything else. 7 years. The house has been like this for 7 years. Clara continued darning. The fire crackled. Snow pressed soft against the kitchen window. It's not his fault, Henry said, from the corner, without looking up from the harness. He said it matter-of-factly, the way he said most things, not defending the Duke, not excusing him either, simply stating what he considered to be an accurate observation. Nobody disputed it, which Clara noted. She lay awake that night in her small room, listening to the house settle in the cold, the familiar series of creaks and pops that old stone makes when the temperature drops. She was thinking, as she often did before sleep, about what she had gathered and what it told her. The Duke of Ashbourne was not a cruel man. She was increasingly certain of this. He was a man who had been broken by grief and who had found, perhaps by accident, that anger was the only form of feeling that did not make him feel helpless. Grief made him helpless. Sadness made him helpless. Even ordinary tiredness, she suspected, made him helpless, because it reminded him of the exhaustion of loss. But anger was active. Anger was a thing you could do, and so he did it, reflexively, the way a person presses a bruise without meaning to. She did not yet know what she was going to do with this understanding. She was an under-housemaid. She was 19 years old. She had been in this house for 4 months. The appropriate response to this situation was probably to simply continue doing her job, stay out of the Duke's way, and leave the management of his moods to Mrs. Drummond and to Tame. And she would continue doing her job. She had no intention of stepping beyond the bounds of her position. But she also knew herself well enough to know that she could not unknow what she knew. She could not unsee what she had seen. And she had the feeling, sitting quiet and calm in the cold dark of that winter night, that things were going to change at Ashbourne, eventually, in some way she could not yet fully see. She was not wrong about this. She was simply a long way from being right about the timeline. The months continued. The snow melted. Spring came to the valley with its usual unhurried generosity, greening the fields and filling the kitchen garden and bringing back the particular combination of birdsong and thawed earth that is unlike any other smell in the world. Clara turned 20 in March, and Bertha made her a small cake with dried fruit and a thin layer of icing, and the servants gathered in the kitchen after dinner and sang a brief and slightly off-key rendition of a birthday song, and Clara smiled the quiet, complete smile that was one of the most genuine things about her. She was not lonely exactly, but she was alone in the particular way that comes from seeing things more clearly than the people around you, not through superiority, but through a different kind of attention. She saw the Duke clearly, and she held that seeing carefully, the way you hold something fragile in your hands in cold weather, taking care not to drop it or crack it with too much pressure. It was in May, 7 months after her arrival, that she first truly witnessed one of the Duke's rages from close range. She had been sent to dust the corridor outside the study, a regular task, usually accomplished without incident, because the Duke was generally in the garden or the library at that time of morning. On this day, he was in the study. She could hear the sound of papers being moved, the scratch of a pen, the occasional heave of a breath that was not quite a sigh but was close to one. She moved carefully, her duster working along the frames of the paintings on the wall, keeping her sounds low and even. Then the post arrived. George brought it up, knocked, was admitted, and left perhaps 30 seconds later, moving past Clara with the particular speed of a man who has just narrowly escaped something. Clara watched him go. She turned back to her dusting. For perhaps a minute there was silence from inside the study. Then the Duke's voice, low and controlled, said something she could not hear. Then something hit the floor, papers by the sound of it, a whole armful at once. Then the voice rose, still not quite shouting but climbing steadily in that way that precedes a shout, directed at nothing in particular, just the walls, the air, the useless fact of whatever was in those letters. Clara stopped her dusting. She stood with her back against the wall beside the study door and listened, not from curiosity but from the same instinct that made her listen to everything, because understanding required observation, and observation required being present. The voice peaked, broke into something wordless, and then there was the crash, not the porcelain cup this time but something heavier, and then a long, stark silence. Clara waited. She counted to 30, slowly, in her head. Then she picked up her duster, finished the last 2 frames of the corridor, and walked quietly back toward the stairs. At the bottom of the staircase, Mrs. Drummond was waiting. She looked at Clara with the steady, assessing gaze she brought to most things. "You were in the corridor," she said. "I was," Clara said. "And?" "Everything is fine," Clara said. "He needs some time." Mrs. Drummond looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said at last, "he does." That was all that was said about it. But something had shifted, very slightly, in the way Mrs. Drummond looked at Clara from that moment on. Something that might, in time, have been called trust, though it would have taken both of them a long time to use that word about it. Clara went back to her duties. The house settled around her. And outside, the May sunshine continued to fall on the valley with complete indifference to the interior storms of the people who lived in it, golden and generous, and entirely unconcerned with the complexities of grief. Summer arrived at Ashbourne the way it always did, without asking permission, spreading its heat across the stone walls and the long grass of the lower fields, and turning the kitchen garden into something green and excessive and slightly overwhelming. Clara had been at the estate for almost a year by the time the longest days came, and she had settled into the house the way a well-made piece of furniture settles into a room, present and functional, and increasingly difficult to imagine the space without. She had been promoted. It had not been announced with any ceremony. Mrs. Drummond had come to find her one morning in the linen room, where Clara was folding pillowcases with the precise and slightly unhurried efficiency that characterized everything she did, and had said, without preamble, that from the first of the month she would be taking on the duties of first housemaid, that her wages would increase accordingly, and that George would now report to her regarding the household cleaning schedule. Clara had said thank you, folded the next pillowcase, and asked whether the change in duties would also include the evening correspondence run to the study, which she had been doing informally for some months, since it had become clear that George would rather face almost any other task. Mrs. Drummond had looked at her with the slightly narrowed expression she used when she suspected she was not quite keeping up with what Clara was actually thinking. "Yes," she had said, "if you are willing." "I am willing," Clara said, and that was that. The correspondence run had become, over the months, one of the most interesting parts of her day. Not because of what happened during it. Nothing much happened. The Duke took the post, sometimes nodded, occasionally said good evening, usually did not, and Clara withdrew with the same quiet competence with which she had entered. But because of what she observed during those brief minutes in the study, which she added, each evening, to the accumulating store of understanding that she was building about this man without quite deciding to build it. She had learned, by now, a great deal. She had learned that he read the London papers in a particular order, business first, then the rest, and that if the business section contained bad news, it colored the remainder of the evening. She had learned that he had a habit of standing at the window when he was thinking, not looking at anything in particular but using the sky and the distance as a kind of emptying out of the interior, the way some people walk when they are sorting through difficult thoughts. She had learned that he was better in the mornings than in the evenings, not calmer, exactly, but more present, more connected to what was immediately in front of him, rather than to whatever lived in the long galleries of his thoughts. She had learned that he noticed things, more than he let on, small things. The fact that a painting in the corridor had been rehung slightly crooked after dusting, and had been returned to True the same afternoon. The fact that the library fire was now always lit before he arrived, because Clara had noticed that he entered a cold room and sat in it for 20 minutes rather than asking anyone to light the fire, which she could only interpret as either stubbornness or the habit of someone who was used to not asking for things. He had never commented on these adjustments, but she was quite sure he noticed them. What she had not yet fully learned, what still sat at the edge of her understanding like something visible only in peripheral vision, was the precise nature of what lived inside the rages. She had a theory, had had it since that winter conversation with Bertha, that it was grief, that the anger was a container for the grief, something that felt more bearable than the actual thing it was holding. But a theory was not the same as knowledge, and she was careful, always, about the difference. It was in late July that she had her first real conversation with the Duke. Not the brief, functional exchanges of the correspondence run. An actual conversation, with sentences in both directions and a genuine subject between them. She had been sent to retrieve a book from the library, one of the household account ledgers that Mrs. Drummond needed, and that had been placed, in a moment of absent-mindedness that was unlike her, on the wrong shelf. The library was at the far end of the house, a long walk from the servants' quarters, and it was a warm evening, and the windows were open, and the smell of cut grass was coming in from the gardens. She found the ledger without difficulty, and she was on her way out when she noticed the Duke, sitting in the deep armchair beside the window with a book open in his lap that he was not reading. He was looking at the garden. He had not heard her come in, which was not unusual. She was quiet by habit, not by design. She could have left without speaking. She almost did. But then he turned his head, saw her, and the expression on his face in that moment was so unguarded, so completely without the usual armor, that she stopped. He looked for just a second, the way people look when they are startled out of a thought they have been deep inside, slightly lost, slightly sad, blinking back to the present from somewhere far away. "Miss Voss," he said. He had learned her name, which she had noted with quiet interest, since he did not use the names of most of the household staff. "I apologize for the interruption," she said. "I came for the ledger. I am going now." "It is no interruption," he said, with the particular flatness of someone who is saying the accurate thing and not the polite thing, which she recognized as one of his habits. "You are simply present in a room I was also in." "Yes," she said. There was a pause. She should have left. She remained, not because she was being impertinent, but because something in the quality of the silence felt like it was asking to be held for a moment longer. "Do you like books?" he asked. It was an unexpected question, and he seemed slightly surprised himself that he had asked it. "Very much," Clara said. "I grew up with very few of them, which I think made me appreciate them more." He looked at the shelves around them, the thousands of volumes in their worn and varied bindings. "There are too many here that have not been read," he said. It was not quite an invitation, but it was not nothing. "A book that has not been read is still a book," Clara said. "It is still waiting. He looked at her then, properly, not the brief registering glance of someone noting a servant in a room, but a real looking, as though he were actually seeing her for the first time. "That is either very patient or very optimistic," he said. "I think they are often the same thing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement of a point made. "Perhaps," he said. She said good evening and left, the ledger under her arm. That night, alone in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and thought about the conversation for a long time, not because she had found it particularly significant, though she was not yet sure it was not. She thought about it because it had surprised her, not his words but his quality in those moments. He had been entirely different from the man she had been carefully observing for almost a year. He had been present, contained and, in his own angular way, curious. He had engaged with what she said and responded to it rather than around it. She had seen this before, she realized. Not often, and not for long, but in the evenings after he had walked in the garden, or on the days when the post brought nothing difficult. There was a man in there who was not the storms. She had suspected this. Now she was more certain of it. She did not know what to do with this certainty. She put it away with the rest of what she knew and went to sleep. August brought the harvest season, which meant extra work for everyone, preserving and storing and accounting for the produce from the kitchen garden and the home farm. It also brought, with the longer evenings and the warm nights, a loosening of the usual household tension. The Duke spent more time outdoors, which meant the servants breathed more freely, which meant the house felt, for a few weeks, like a slightly different place. He was still difficult. He always was, to some degree. But there were days in August when Clara observed him returning from a long ride with something that might, in another man, have been described as ease. He sat at dinner and ate without visible displeasure. He stood in the kitchen garden one afternoon, while Bertha showed him what she had done with the bean crop, which she was particularly proud of, and he listened, and he said something that made her laugh. Clara was carrying a basket of vegetables at the time and saw this from across the garden. She noted it, filed it, and continued with her task. What she was compiling, without having named it as such, was a map of when he was approachable and when he was not, when the interior weather was clear and when it was dark, what conditions produced which states. It was not a project she had set herself. It was simply the natural result of her nature, of being the kind of person who watched carefully and remembered what she saw. George noticed she had been at the estate nearly a year without a single unpleasant encounter with the Duke, which was, by his accounting, some kind of record. "You just keep out of his way at the right times," George told her one evening, with the tone of a man who has been trying to do the same and failing. "Partly," Clara agreed. "Mostly," he said. She smiled slightly, which he interpreted as confirmation and she intended as something more complicated. She was not simply avoiding him, she was learning him, and there was a difference, though she was not yet sure it mattered enough to explain. What mattered, she had decided, was not whether she understood Edmund Harrogate. She was a housemaid. Her understanding was irrelevant to him and to the running of this house. What mattered was doing her work well, and continuing to do it, and being present in a way that was steady and reliable, and letting the rest accumulate at whatever pace it chose to accumulate. She was not hurrying toward anything. She was simply there. But things were accumulating. The first time he stopped her in the corridor to ask her a direct question, she was carrying a tea tray to the drawing room where a visiting solicitor had been waiting for 40 minutes. The Duke came down the stairs and met her at the bottom, and instead of passing her, he stopped. "The Carlisle tenancy agreement," he said. "Has Mrs. Drummond spoken with you about the room preparation for the solicitor?" "I have the tea tray here," Clara said. "The room was prepared this morning." "Good." He looked at the tray, then at her. "He is a man who takes his tea without milk. Tell Bertha." "I will," she said. He moved past her. She continued to the drawing room. When she returned to the kitchen, she relayed the tea instruction to Bertha, who received it with a slight raising of eyebrows. "He told you that?" Bertha said. "He did. He didn't send for me or Mrs. Drummond. He stopped me in the corridor." Bertha processed this for a moment. "That's new," she said finally. Clara agreed that it was new. She was not certain yet what it meant. The most obvious reading was simply that he had come downstairs and seen her first, and conveyed the information by the most direct route. That was probably all it was. And yet she had been at Ashbourne long enough to know that the Duke of Ashbourne rarely spoke to anyone without a reason, and that his reasons, when they existed, were usually precise. She was still turning this over when Mrs. Drummond appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the expression on Clara's face and said, "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing," Clara said. "You never look like nothing," Mrs. Drummond said. which was as close to a compliment as she usually came, and then she was gone again. September arrived, the beginning of Clara's second year at Ashbourne, marked by the golden, cooling quality of light that late summer casts across the northern countryside. The way the sky changes from the hard blue of July to something softer, more contemplative. The harvest was mostly in. The kitchen smelled of apples and stored onions and the particular sweetness of preserving. The estate settled into the quieter pace of autumn. It was in this settling that the event happened, the one that Clara would, for years afterward, identify as the first real turning point. She was in the upper corridor on a Tuesday afternoon, applying beeswax to the panels of the long gallery, a task that required moving slowly along the wall with a cloth and a tin of wax, methodical and somewhat meditative. She was halfway down the gallery when she heard the Duke coming up the stairs. She recognized his walk, everyone did. It had a particular quality, heavier than most and faster than seemed quite natural for a large house. The walk of someone accustomed to moving through the world with authority. He came along the gallery toward her, and she drew slightly to one side to allow him to pass, and he slowed, which she had not expected, and then stopped. "Miss Voss," he said. "Good afternoon," she said. He looked at the gallery wall, at the panels she had been working on. She had gotten through perhaps a third of them. The waxed sections had a soft, even gleam that the unwaxed sections lacked. "This is good work," he said. She was not sure how to receive this, because he was not a man who offered praise easily or often. She said, "Thank you," and meant it, without making more of it than it was. He stood for a moment, and she had the impression he was going to say something else but was undecided. Then he said, "You have been here nearly a year." "Just over a year," she said. "Yes." He looked at the far end of the gallery, where the light was coming in from the high windows. "That is longer than most." "I find the work suits me," she said. He looked at her then, with the direct, slightly unsettling attention he occasionally turned on things he was actually interested in. "Why?" he asked. It was a genuine question. She could tell because he was waiting for a real answer rather than a polite one. She considered for a moment. "Because this is a real place," she said. "The work here matters. The house has been here for 200 years, and it will be here for 200 more, and what we do now contributes to that. I find that satisfying." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Most people would not describe it that way. Most people have not thought about it as long as I have," she said. Something crossed his face, quick and complex, something between amusement and genuine interest. He did not smile, but the muscles around his eyes shifted in a way that was its own kind of acknowledgement. "No," he said, "I suppose they have not." He continued down the gallery and was gone. Clara turned back to her wax and her cloth and continued working. But her pulse was slightly faster than it had been, not from nerves but from something that felt more like the quality of attention you give to a thing when you realize it has turned out to be more interesting than you initially expected. She was beginning to understand him better, and the better she understood him, the more certain she became that whatever had broken inside him was not permanent. Damage and permanence were not the same thing. She had seen this in the farm, in animals that had been frightened or hurt, in the way a field that had flooded badly in spring could be entirely recovered by autumn if the right conditions were offered. She was not comparing the Duke of Ashbourne to a flooded field, and she was simply noting that recovery was possible, that it required the right conditions, and that she was present in this house in a way that was, perhaps, one of those conditions. Not because she had power over him, or wished any, but because she was steady. And steadiness, she had always believed, was the thing that frightened people learned to trust most, over time, when it was offered without a price. She finished the gallery by 3 o'clock, packed up her cloth and her tin, and went downstairs to find out what else the day needed from her. October came in with wind, and the sound of it in the old oak trees at the edge of the property. A constant, low, rushing sound that Clara had come to associate with the turning of the year, and with the particular quality of thought that comes when the days shorten and the evenings grow long. The Duke of Ashbourne was not well. It was not a dramatic illness. There was no fever, no collapse, nothing that would have warranted summoning a doctor immediately. It was the kind of illness that quiet men get when they have been running on something other than sleep for too long. A bone-deep exhaustion, a pallor that was not quite healthy, a tendency to leave meals half-eaten and to stand at windows for long stretches without appearing to see what was in front of them. Mrs. Drummond had noticed. Bertha had noticed. Clara had noticed most thoroughly of all, because she had the clearest picture of what was usual and what was not. What was not usual was the way he had been coughing for 2 weeks now, the slightly hollow sound of it. The fact that he had cancelled a meeting with his land agent twice in a row without rescheduling, which was entirely unlike him. "He needs to see the doctor," Bertha said at the servants' table one evening, in the low voice that they all used when discussing the Duke below stairs. "He won't go to the doctor." "He doesn't believe in going to the doctor," George said. "He thinks they only tell you things you don't want to hear." "That is because they do," Henry said from his corner. "That is rather the point," Clara said, and the table went quiet for a moment. Not because what she said was surprising, but because it was accurate, and nobody had quite said it that directly before. "Someone should tell him," Bertha said. There was a long and meaningful silence. Clara returned to her darning. She was not going to tell him. It was not her place. And she knew the difference between recognizing what ought to be done and deciding it was her responsibility to do it. Mrs. Drummond was the appropriate person. She said as much, carefully and without pressure, when she had a moment alone with the housekeeper the following morning. Mrs. Drummond looked at her over the top of the household accounts she was reviewing. "I have mentioned it," she said. "And he told me he was perfectly well, and I should attend to my own business." Clara said nothing for a moment. "Did you tell him that his business is your business, since you manage his household?" Mrs. Drummond's expression did something complicated. "I have managed this man for 14 years, she said. "I know how far I can push." "Yes," Clara said. "Of course." She left it at that. But she was thinking. The following Friday, which she had learned to approach with extra caution because Friday's London post was the most frequent source of difficulty, she was on her way to the study with the afternoon correspondence when she heard him coughing behind the closed door. It was a longer cough than she had heard before, and when it stopped, there was a silence that felt effortful. She knocked, waited, was admitted. He was standing by the window in his usual thinking position, but he was slightly hunched, which was not like him. When he turned, his face was more drawn than it had been even a week ago. He looked at the letters she was holding, and something crossed his face that was unmistakably reluctance. "The post," she said, setting it in its usual place. "Yes," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. She was almost at the door when she stopped. She turned back. She looked at him, the way she sometimes allowed herself to look, directly and without pretense, not impudently but honestly. "There is a doctor in Wenbury who specializes in respiratory complaints," she said. "He has a very good reputation. He visits the village on Wednesdays." The Duke looked at her. His expression was the kind that precedes a sharp response, the tightening around the jaw, the focusing of the eyes. But she did not look away, and she did not add anything. And after a moment, the sharpness in his expression did something unexpected. It softened, not entirely, but enough. "You are the second person this week to suggest that," he said. "Perhaps the second person is the one you needed to hear it from," she said, and immediately wondered if she had stepped too far. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the grate popped once. Wind moved against the window. "Wednesday," he said finally. "Wednesday," she confirmed. She left. She did not tell anyone what had been said. But on the following Wednesday, the Duke's horse was called for early in the morning, and he was gone for most of the day, and when he returned he looked, if not improved, at least slightly less resigned to whatever had been building in his chest. By the end of the month he was better, not completely, but noticeably. He began finishing his meals again. The cough faded. He went back to his early morning walks. Nobody asked Clara whether she had been involved in this. She did not offer the information. But Mrs. Drummond looked at her one morning with an expression that was something very close to respect and said, "You spoke to him about the doctor." "I mentioned it," Clara said. "He would not hear it from me." "He had already heard it from you," Clara said. "He simply needed to hear that other people could see it too." Mrs. Drummond considered this. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I am not entirely sure," Mrs. Drummond said, which was the most honest answer she could have given. November arrived, and with it the anniversary, the 7th anniversary of the death of Catherine Harrogate, who had been the Duchess of Ashbourne and who had been, by all accounts, the person who had understood this house and the man at its center better than anyone else had managed to, before or since. Clara knew the date because Bertha had told her, with the careful gravity of someone conveying information that needed to be held respectfully. "The 3rd of November, Bertha had said, "in late October. You want to know about it so you can be prepared. Not because there's anything particular that happens. There isn't. He doesn't mark it outwardly. But the house feels it." Clara had thought about this. In what way? "Quieter," Bertha had said. "He is quieter on that day. Not the bad quiet, the storm quiet. A different kind. Sadder. And you don't want to get in front of that." "No," Clara had agreed. "You don't want to get in front of grief." She had been thinking about what Bertha told her all through October, turning it over in the way she turned over everything that mattered. The death of a person who loves us leaves a shape in the world that nothing else fills. She understood this abstractly, having lost her grandmother when she was 12, a woman she had loved very much, and having found, in the months afterward, that the world simply had a new and permanent gap in it that she eventually learned to move around. The Duke's gap was larger, and he had not yet learned to move around it. 7 years was not actually a long time, though it sounded like one. Some losses required more than 7 years. On the 3rd of November, Clara went about her duties with the usual quiet efficiency, but with an additional layer of care, keeping her movements soft, staying out of the main corridors when she could hear the Duke near them, making sure the fires were lit and the rooms were warm without requiring anything of him. She did deliver the evening correspondence. It was her duty, and she did not see why his grief should prevent him from receiving his post, but she knocked more softly than usual, waited a beat longer than usual before entering, and crossed the room quickly when she came in. He was sitting at his desk. He was not reading. He was sitting with his hands on the surface of the desk and his eyes on a photograph in a small silver frame that she had not seen on the desk before. It was a woman in the frame, small and fair, with light eyes and a composed and slightly amused expression. Clara set the post on the desk without looking at the photograph. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was so quiet and so completely without its usual edge that she almost stopped again. Almost. She said good evening and left. She walked back to the servants' staircase with the same steady pace she always used. She went downstairs and helped Bertha with the last of the evening washing up, and sat at the table for a while with the other servants, and she did not say anything about what she had seen, and nobody asked. But that night, lying in her small cold room with the November wind working at the window, she felt something that she had been holding at arm's length for a long time. She felt sorry for him, not the vague, distant pity she had felt in the early months, the kind you feel for a situation. Something closer and more specific, the sorrow you feel for a person you have come to know well enough to understand exactly what they have lost. She did not let herself stay with it too long. Sympathy was useful. It helped you understand. Sentiment was different, and she was careful about sentiment. But she acknowledged it, there in the dark, and then she set it aside, and she went to sleep. The December that followed was cold and bright and brought with it the particular energy of a household preparing for winter in earnest. There were extra tasks, extra linens to bring out, extra firewood to be moved and stacked, extra preserves to be counted and arranged. Clara moved through all of it with her customary thoroughness, and the house hummed around her with the low, seasonal industry of a place that knows what it needs to do. And all through that December she noticed something. The Duke was different. Not radically. Not in any way that would have been obvious to someone who did not watch carefully. But she watched carefully, and she could see it. He was, very slightly, less alone. He still moved through the house as he always had, largely self-contained, rarely seeking company. But there were small things. He asked Bertha a question about the kitchen garden, a real question that required a real answer, and listened to the answer. He told George, not unkindly, that his polishing of the entrance hall mirror had been thorough, which was as near a compliment as anyone had heard from him in years. He stopped Henry one afternoon in the yard, and talked with him for nearly 10 minutes about the condition of the west gate, which needed replacing, and he listened to Henry's assessment with what appeared to be genuine interest. He was, in small and incremental ways, re-engaging with the world around him. Clara noted this with care and without interpretation. She did not tell herself a story about it. She simply recorded it, the way she recorded everything, and added it to the accumulating picture she was building. It was, she thought, what happened when a person who had been in the dark for a long time was slowly offered, from multiple quiet directions, the possibility that it was safe to come back into the light. It did not happen all at once. It happened in moments, in small exchanges, in the accumulated evidence of consistency. She was part of that consistency. She knew it, quietly and without pride. She was a steady thing in this house, and steady things, over time, were what frightened people learned to lean toward. She did not lean back. That was not her role, and she did not want it to be. But she was there, and she was steady, and she continued, through December and into the new year, to be exactly those things without asking for anything in return. The new year brought frost and a clarity in the air that made everything look sharper and more defined. The bare trees against the pale sky, the stone walls of the estate, the long flat fields beyond the gate. Clara had been at Ashbourne for 16 months. She was 20 years old, first housemaid, reliable, steady, and increasingly certain that she understood this house and the man at its center in a way that was unusual, and that she had not quite yet figured out what to do with. She had begun to see something she had not seen before. She saw it gradually, the way you see something in fog that only becomes a clear shape when you are close enough to it. What she saw was this. The Duke of Ashbourne was not actually a difficult man. He was a man in difficulty. These were not the same thing, and the difference mattered enormously. A difficult man creates his problems. He is the source of his own trouble, and other people are simply the recipients. A man in difficulty has had trouble arrived at him, from outside, and he has not yet found a way through it. He is still inside the difficulty, turning in it, trying to find a door that leads back to the person he was before everything went wrong. She did not know if she was right about this. She could not be certain. She was a housemaid, not a physician of the mind. But she had been watching him for 16 months with the most careful attention she had, and everything she had observed pointed in the same direction. The grief was the center of it. Everything else, the rages, the coldness, the isolation, the way he moved through his own house as though it were a place he was staying in temporarily, all of it grew from that center, the way weeds grow from a root you cannot quite reach to pull out. She thought about what it would take to get to that root, not to manage him, not to fix him, because people were not things to be fixed, but to give him, somehow, access to a part of himself he had closed off, the part that was still connected to the person Catherine Harrogate had known, and loved, and been able to match. She did not yet have an answer. She simply held the question. January was cold and quiet and useful in that way, giving her time to think clearly, and she used the clarity well. By the time February arrived, she had decided something. Not a plan, not exactly, more an orientation. She had decided that if the opportunity came, and she did not know when or in what form it would come, she would be honest. Not brutally, not recklessly, but she would not deflect or soften in the way that people usually deflected around him, because deflecting had not helped him, and had not helped anyone in this house. She would be honest when the time required it, and she would trust that honesty was the thing that had been most absent from his life since his wife died. She was not looking for the moment. She was simply ready for it if it came. It came sooner than she expected, and in a way she had not anticipated at all. She was in the library on a Tuesday afternoon in February, reshelving a set of books that had been left on the reading table, when the Duke came in. She was on the ladder that reached the upper shelves, her back to the door, and he had opened it with his usual quiet efficiency, and neither of them had been prepared for the other. She came down the ladder calmly, carrying the last two books. "I did not know you were in here," he said. He was holding a letter that he had clearly just come in to read privately, away from the study, which was something she had noticed him doing occasionally, when the post contained things he wanted to think about. "I was just finishing," she said, setting the last two books in their places on the lower shelf. "It is not urgent," he said. "Carry on." She picked up the wooden box she had been using to transport the books, and he moved to the armchair he favored, and she should have simply left. But she paused, because the letter in his hand had a particular quality of being gripped rather than held, the knuckles slightly set, the paper slightly bent, and she recognized that quality from the Fridays and the bad evenings and all the times she had stood at the edge of things and watched from a careful distance. "Is everything all right?" she asked. She said it the way she said most things, without warmth she did not mean, and without the stiff formality that people sometimes used in its place. She simply asked, directly. He looked at her, with an expression that was very nearly surprise. "Why do you ask?" "You are holding that letter very tightly," she said. He looked down at the letter in his hand, as though he had not noticed until now how tightly he was holding it. He relaxed his grip slightly. Then he said, "It is from my brother's solicitor." She waited. This was another thing she was good at, waiting without filling the silence with unnecessary words. "My brother has decided to challenge certain terms of our father's will," he said, in the tone of a man reciting a fact that contains considerably more than the words convey. "It is something that has been approached before, at intervals, and always at the most inopportune times." He paused. "It is tiresome." "Yes," she said. "I imagine it is. It will require a trip to London," he said, "which I dislike." "Is there someone who could represent your interests there, so you would not have to go yourself?" He looked at her. "My solicitor is there." "Then perhaps he could manage the initial stages," she said, "and save you the journey until it becomes unavoidable." There was a pause. He looked at the letter again, and something in his posture shifted, very slightly, the way someone's posture shifts when an idea they had been circling from a distance suddenly becomes available from close up. "That is," he said, "a practical suggestion." "I am a practical person," she said. And then, unexpectedly, he said something she had not heard him say before, at least not in a tone that carried any warmth in it. he said. "I know you are, Miss Voss." She left the library, she walked back to the servants' quarters, and she sat in the kitchen with her box of books and Bertha's company, and a cup of tea, and felt, quietly and without ceremony, that something at Ashbourne had shifted another degree in a new direction. It was slow work, and it was not her work to do deliberately. It was simply what happened when two people inhabited the same space for long enough, when one of them was consistently honest and consistently steady, and the other was exhausted enough, finally, to begin to trust it. Spring arrived late that year, hesitating behind a long run of cold March weeks before finally committing to itself in April, and when it came it brought the usual surprise that spring always brings, the shock of green where there had been gray, the smell of thawed earth, the sound of birds returning to the trees outside the kitchen garden with the absolute confidence of creatures who have made this journey before, and know it is worth making. Clara was 20 years old and had been at Ashbourne for 18 months. She had settled into her work so thoroughly that she could no longer clearly remember what it had felt like to be new here, to walk through these corridors without knowing which floorboards to avoid, and which corners got cold, and what the household required of each day. The estate had become, if not home exactly, then something like the nearest equivalent she had found outside of her father's farm. She did not often think about leaving. The thought did come, occasionally, in the way that all thoughts come to a person who thinks carefully about their life, not with urgency but with a quiet curiosity. She could leave. She had skills now that were worth more than she had brought here, and references that Mrs. Drummond would give generously and that Mrs. Aldred from Fenwick Hall had already given. She could go to a larger establishment, one with more staff and more social life, and perhaps less of the particular tension that living in Ashbourne required. She did not go. She was not ready to go, and she had learned, over her 20 years, to trust the instincts that told her when something was finished and when it was not. Ashbourne was not finished. She was not yet sure what she was waiting for, but she was waiting for something, and her patience was enough to carry her through not knowing what it was. The London matter with the Duke's brother had been resolved, as far as she could tell, without the Duke having to travel anywhere. She did not know the details, and it was not her business to know them, but the fact of the resolution was visible in the way his posture changed in the weeks following, a small but real releasing of something he had been carrying since the letter arrived. She was attentive to these things. She had been attentive to them since her first months here. What she was building, and she allowed herself to think of it in these terms now, was not a relationship, that was not the right word for what existed between a housemaid and a duke, but rather an understanding, a mutual and growing awareness that was entirely different from the transactional formality of employer and employee. It was not that they were friends. They were not. The distance between their positions in the world was real, and Clara was clear-eyed about what that distance meant, and had always meant, and would likely always mean. But within the particular space of Ashbourne, within the specific world of its corridors and its rooms and its daily rhythms, something had grown between them that was genuine, and that she did not have a simple word for. He spoke to her differently than he spoke to most of the household, not more warmly exactly, because warmth was not a quality he deployed freely, but more directly, without the layer of absent-minded dismissiveness that characterized most of his interactions with the staff. When he addressed her, which was not as simple as it sounded. She heard about this from George, who had noticed. "He talks to you," George said, one afternoon in April when they were both in the entrance hall, she polishing the banisters and he carrying a tray to the dining room. "He speaks to all of us," she said. "He gives orders to all of us," George corrected. "That is different. He actually talks to you." Clara continued polishing. "He speaks to Mrs. Drummond. That is different too. That is management. I mean, he actually says things to you that are not orders or questions about the household." She considered this. "Does that concern you?" George seemed uncertain. "No," he said. "It is just strange." She supposed it was strange, by the standards of how things usually worked, but she had long since stopped measuring Ashbourne against the standards of how things usually worked, because this house had never quite operated by those standards, and the man at its center never had either. What she knew was this: the more the Duke spoke to her, the more she was able to see, and the more she saw, the more complex the picture became. He was not, as she had confirmed to herself over and over, a simple man. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had closed himself off from the world at a moment when the world had hurt him beyond his capacity to absorb the hurt, and who had been closed off for long enough that he had lost the habits of openness that had once been natural to him. These habits could come back. She believed this. She had seen evidence of their return in small things, in the questions he asked that showed curiosity, in the way he had begun to take slightly more interest in the estate's tenants. in the small adjustments to his daily patterns that suggested a person re-engaging with the texture of life, rather than simply passing through it. But she was also aware that there were things she could not see. There were the bad Fridays and the worse Fridays. There was the anger that still erupted, less frequently perhaps than in the early months, but still present. There were the evenings when she brought the post and found him in a state that was difficult to categorize, not angry, not sad, simply closed, every door shut, nothing available. She could not see inside those states. She could only observe them from the outside, which was always an incomplete view. In May, something happened that gave her a fuller picture than she had expected. She was going through the East Wing, which was largely unused, and which she cleaned on a rotating basis to prevent deterioration, when she passed the small room that had been Catherine Harrowgate's sitting room. It was always kept closed. She had asked about it once, carefully, and Mrs. Drummond had said only that it was kept as it had been, that nothing had been moved. She had never gone in. It was not part of her duties, and she was not the kind of person who went into rooms that were not her business. But on this particular day, the door was open, not wide, just slightly, perhaps 4 inches, and she would have continued past it, except that she could hear something from inside, a sound, the Duke's voice, low and private, and entirely unlike the voice she heard in ordinary circumstances, speaking to someone who was not there. She stopped. She did not move closer. She stood where she was in the corridor and she listened for only a moment, long enough to understand that he was talking to his wife, to the woman in the silver-framed photograph, to the person whose absence had become the organizing fact of his life. She moved away, quickly and quietly, and continued down the corridor, and she did not look back at the open door. But she thought about what she had heard, and she thought about it for a long time. She thought about what it meant that a man who kept everything inside, who wore silence like a coat, who had driven away staff and solicitors and visiting family members with the force of his self-containment, went alone to a closed room to talk to someone who was gone. She thought about the grief that required that, about the love that made that grief possible, about the particular tenderness that exists in a person who has loved deeply and lost the person they loved, a tenderness that looks nothing like tenderness from the outside because it has been wrapped in every available protective covering. She did not pity him for this. What she felt was something closer to recognition, the recognition of seeing, clearly and fully, who a person is. She felt that she finally had the last piece of the picture. She understood what drove the anger, not just abstractly, as a theory about grief, but specifically, the love that was still there with nowhere to go, the conversation that still continued in a closed room where no one was. She went about her work. She said nothing. But she carried what she had heard with her like a key she did not yet have a lock for. Summer came to Ashbourne again, the second she had seen, and Clara moved through it with the quiet efficiency that was her nature, and the added layer of understanding she had gathered over the preceding months. She was 21 now, technically still young by most measurements, but she had the quality of some people who seem, from early in their lives, to carry more years of understanding than the calendar would suggest. The estate was beginning to feel, in small ways, different. The Duke had requested, for the first time anyone could remember, that the July garden party be revived. This was a tradition that had lapsed entirely after his wife's death, an afternoon gathering of neighboring families, nothing elaborate, just tea, and the garden in its summer fullness and the normal social commerce of people who lived within reasonable distance of one another. Mrs. Drummond had received this request with the controlled astonishment of a woman who has been surprised and is determined not to show it too obviously. "He wants the garden party back," she told Clara, standing in the kitchen with the Duke's written note in her hand as though she were not quite sure it was real. "When?" Clara asked. "The 15th of July. "That gives us 3 weeks," Clara said. "What does he want specifically?" Mrs. Drummond looked at the note. "Tea, cold meats, garden access. He says he will leave the details to me." "Then we have time," Clara said. "What do you need me to do?" Mrs. Drummond looked at her, then back at the note, then back at her. "Start with the garden chairs. We will need them all out, and the white linen for the tables." "Of course," Clara said. She left the kitchen. Behind her she heard Mrs. Drummond say, to nobody in particular, "Well, something has changed." Clara thought, as she went to find the garden chairs, that Mrs. Drummond was right. Something had changed, but it had not changed suddenly. It had changed the way most real things change, slowly, through the accumulation of small moments, through the patient application of consistency and honesty, and the willingness to simply remain in a place that was difficult to remain in. The garden party went well. Not perfectly. The Duke was still not at ease in large social gatherings, and there were 2 moments in the afternoon when Clara, watching from a discreet distance as she helped serve, could see him reaching toward the old difficulty, the jaw setting, the eyes going flat. But both times something redirected him, a question from a neighbor's child who had wandered near, an unexpected remark from the land agent's wife that made him, briefly, laugh, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised everyone near enough to hear it. The laughter was the thing she remembered afterward, not the party, not the accomplishment of the event, but that sound, unfamiliar and brief and entirely real, in the summer air of the garden. She collected cups and plates, kept things running, and felt, quietly in herself, that the long work of 18 months had produced something, not an ending and not a conclusion, but the visible beginning of something better. She was right about that. She was also about to discover how much harder things were going to get before they got better. August arrived with the kind of settled heat that requires patience, and Clara moved through the estate's summer tasks with the steady pace she brought to everything. The garden party had not transformed Ashbourne. It had not been expected to. What it had done was open a door, a specific, particular kind of door, that is only available when a person chooses to stop living entirely behind their own walls. The Duke had opened that door very slightly, and Clara was careful not to notice it too obviously, or to push it further than he had chosen to open it himself. She understood this clearly. It was not her role to manage his healing, if that was even the right word for it. It was her role to be a reliable and honest presence, to do her work well, and to be available for honesty when honesty was required. She was not his counselor or his confidant. She was his first housemaid. The fact that she understood him better than almost anyone in the house did not change the nature of their positions, and she was careful about that. But she also knew that understanding could be a form of presence, and presence was what this house had been lacking for 7 years. Not the physical presence of people. The house was full of people. But the presence of someone who actually looked at the Duke of Ashbourne and saw what was there, rather than what they expected to see or what they were afraid to see. She looked. She continued to look. And what she saw, through August and into September, was a man who was very slowly, and with considerable difficulty, finding his way back to something he had lost. He began going to church again, something he had apparently stopped doing after his wife's death. Not with conspicuous devotion, nothing that anyone would call piety. He simply appeared in the village church on 2 Sunday mornings in August, sat quietly in the Ashbourne pew, and left without speaking to anyone at length. Bertha reported this, with the tone of someone who considers this a sign of something important. He began asking the land agent about the tenants' situations, not just the financial ones but the actual circumstances, whether any of the families had particular needs, whether the harvest was likely to be good for them. The land agent, apparently somewhat surprised by the nature of the questions, had answered carefully and thoroughly, and the Duke had listened and in 2 cases had made quiet adjustments that were, Clara gathered from what George reported, considerably more generous than what was strictly necessary. He began walking further than before. She saw him sometimes, from the upstairs windows, moving across the lower fields with the long stride he had when he was thinking hard, getting smaller in the distance and then returning, and always returning slightly different, slightly more at ease, as though the walking burned off something that the house's interior could not. She did not speak to him about any of this. There was nothing to say. These were his choices, his movements, his private re-engagement with the world. She had no place in the narrative of them except as a distant and consistent witness. What she did do, on an afternoon in September when she happened to be in the library reshelving and he happened to come in to look for a particular book, was engage when he offered conversation. He was looking for a book about the management of drainage in agricultural land, which was not a particularly exciting subject but which he had apparently been reading about in the context of the lower fields, which were prone to waterlogging in wet seasons. He couldn't find the volume and was looking along the shelves with the focused irritation he brought to anything that was not exactly where he expected it to be. Clara was on the rolling ladder near the agricultural section. 3rd shelf from the top, she said. Between the water management volume and the one about crop rotation. It was reshelved last month. He found it, pulled it out, looked at the spine, and looked at her. How did you know where it was? I reshelved it, she said. You know where every book in this library is. She considered this. I know where most of them are, she said. I have reshelved everything in this room at some point. The organization is not quite logical, but it has a pattern. He looked at the shelves with the slightly narrowed expression he used when he was genuinely interested in something and did not want to seem too obviously interested. What is the pattern? It is not quite by subject and not quite by date, she said, coming down the ladder. It is something in between. Someone organized this library a long time ago with a system in their head that they never wrote down. If you understand the system, you can find anything. If you do not, it looks random. And you have understood the system. After about 6 months of paying attention, yes. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming in through the long windows, soft and slightly golden the way September light always is. And the smell of old paper and beeswax was everywhere. And for a moment the library felt entirely quiet and very still. "That is," he said, "an unusual thing to have done." "I like books," she said, "and I like patterns." It was interesting. "Did it not seem an excessive use of your time?" "No," she said simply. "I thought it might be useful to someone eventually." He looked at the book in his hand, and then at the shelves, and then at her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. It was not warm exactly, and it was not distant. It was the expression of a man who has just registered something about the person in front of him that he had not previously registered. A kind of genuine, uncomplicated attention. "You are quite remarkable, Miss Voss," he said. He said it the way he said most things, without embellishment, as a simple statement of what he considered to be an accurate assessment. She said nothing, because she did not know what to say that would not be either falsely modest or inappropriately self-congratulatory. She simply looked at him with the same steady attention she always offered, and he held her gaze for a moment, and then something in the air between them shifted, the way air shifts when the barometric pressure changes, not visible but felt. He said good afternoon and left with his book. Clara stood in the library for a moment, alone, listening to the sounds of the house around her. The clock in the hall ticking, the distant sound of Bertha in the kitchen, wind moving against the high windows. She thought about what he had said. She thought about the way he had said it. She thought about the expression that had been on his face. And then she picked up her box of books, finished the reshelving, and went to find out what else the afternoon required. October came back around, Clara's second October at Ashbourne, and with it the color and the cold and the specific sense that things were moving towards something. She could feel it without being able to name it, the way you can feel the change in the weather before you can see it in the sky. The estate was different, she was different, and the man at the center of it was different, slowly and not without difficulty, but genuinely different in a way that was more than temporary. She had been promoted again. This time it was not without ceremony. Mrs. Drummond had called her into the housekeeper's sitting room, which was a very small room off the servants' hall that smelled of the dried lavender Mrs. Drummond kept in a bowl on the windowsill, and of the coal fire that burned there on cold days. She had asked Clara to sit, which was not something she usually did when delivering instructions, and she had told her that the position of senior housemaid was available, that the wages were considerably better, and that the additional responsibilities would include the management of the junior household staff and the oversight of the cleaning and maintenance schedule for the entire house. "You would report directly to me," Mrs. Drummond said, "and in my absence you would manage the household in full." Clara had looked at her. "I am 21, she said. "I know how old you are," Mrs. Drummond said, with a slight edge of impatience. "The question is whether you want the position." "Yes," Clara said, "I want the position." "Good," Mrs. Drummond said, and that was the end of the ceremony. The increased responsibilities suited Clara in the way that all greater demands on her capabilities tended to suit her, by giving her more to pay attention to. She was not someone who thrived in idleness. Her mind needed occupation, and the wider scope of the senior housemaid role gave her mind more to occupy itself with. She also found, unexpectedly, that she enjoyed the management of the other staff. Not in the sense of exercising authority, she was not interested in authority for its own sake, but in the same way she had learned to understand the Duke by watching carefully, she found she could understand the junior staff by paying attention to what they needed, not what they said they needed, which was not always the same thing, but what would actually help them do their work better and feel more settled in it. Nell, the young kitchen girl, needed to be given small, specific tasks that had clear completion points, because she became anxious when instructions were too open-ended. George, the footman, needed to be told when he had done something well, because he had a deep uncertainty about his own competence, that regular positive feedback from a reliable source began, very slowly, to address. Henry needed to be left largely to his own devices, with clear communication about what was expected, and then the freedom to accomplish it in his own way, because he had been working in this house longer than anyone else, and the surest way to get good work from him was to respect that. She learned all of this the same way she learned everything, through careful observation and patient attention, and the willingness to adjust her understanding when new information suggested it needed adjusting. She applied the same method to the Duke, who was, in many ways, more complex than any of the other staff, and who required the same essential approach, clear expectations, honesty rather than pretense, and the space to be what he was, without being managed or maneuvered. What she was beginning to understand, in this second October, was that her relationship with him was genuinely without precedent in her experience, and probably in his. It was not the relationship of employer and employee, though it was that too. It was not friendship, which required an equality of position that did not exist between them. It was not exactly mentorship in either direction, though she had learned from him and she had, in some quiet way, given him something that he had learned from. What it was, she decided on a cold October evening when she was lying in her room thinking about it more carefully than was probably useful, was a kind of witnessing. She witnessed him. She saw him, accurately and fully, without needing him to be different from what he was, and without the fear that prevented most of the other people in his life from seeing him clearly. And he, she thought, had begun to know that he was being witnessed, had begun to feel it, had begun, perhaps, to allow himself to need it. She was careful with this thought. She was very careful with it, because she was aware that there were ways this kind of dynamic could become unbalanced, ways in which the seen person could become too dependent on the seeing, or the seer could mistake understanding for a kind of ownership or claim. She did not want either of those things. She did not want to be indispensable to him in the way that created need rather than strength. She wanted what she offered to make him more capable of being himself, not less capable of existing without her. This was a complicated thing to want, and she was not always sure she was achieving it, but she held it as the intention, and she measured what she did against it, and mostly she believed she was on the right side of the line. November arrived, the 3rd of November, the anniversary again. She prepared in the same way she had the previous year, with the same additional layer of quietness, the same careful management of the house's rhythms. She delivered the post that evening and found him in the study, this time not at his desk but standing at the window, the silver frame in his hand, holding it with the careful attention of a man who knows he is holding something irreplaceable. She set the post down. She was almost at the door when he spoke. "My wife was not afraid of me," he said. She turned. She was not sure if he had intended to say it aloud, or if it had simply come out. He was still looking at the photograph. "No," she said. "Most people are," he said. He said it without self-pity, simply as an observation about a fact. She was not. She thought my temper was largely theatrical and said so. Clara waited. She was not entirely wrong, he said. "No," Clara agreed. He looked up from the photograph then, directly at her. He had the look of a man who has said something he had not expected to say and was now faced with having said it. "She sounds like a person of sound judgment," Clara said. Something moved across his face. It was quick and complicated, a mixture of grief and something else, something that might have been relief. "She was," he said. "She was the soundest judgment I ever encountered." There was a silence. The fire moved. The room was very still. "I am sorry," Clara said, "for your loss. I know it is not recent, but I do not think the length of time changes the reality of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly, "it does not." She said good evening and left. Walking back down the corridor, she felt the weight of what had happened in that room settling over her, not uncomfortable, but real. He had let her in, just slightly, just for a moment, through a door he kept tightly closed. He had spoken about his wife to her in a way she had never heard him speak about her before, not even obliquely. He had shown her something private and true. She held it carefully, as she held all of it. The house moved through the dark of November into December, and the days shortened and the fires burned, and Clara went about her work with the steadiness that was her nature. She was 21 years old and she was beginning to understand that this story she was living inside was not going to resolve quickly or neatly, and that was all right. Some stories required patience. Some things only became clear when you had been present for long enough to see the full shape of them. She was present. She was patient. She continued. What she did not know, in that December, was that January would bring a set of letters from London that would push the Duke of Ashbourne to the very edge of what he had, and that when he reached that edge, she would be the one standing close enough to matter. She could not have known this. She was a 21-year-old housemaid in a northern estate, doing her work as well as she could and paying attention to everything around her. But she was also the person who had been building, slowly and without a name for it, exactly the understanding that would make the difference when the moment came. She had been building it for 2 years, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, evening by evening, through the long work of simply being honest, in a place where honesty had been absent for a very long time. She was nearly ready. She did not know it, but she was nearly ready. What came next would test every piece of what she had learned, every instinct she had honed, every quiet truth she had gathered and held and waited to use. It would come in a winter storm, in a study with broken things on the floor, and it would require from her the only thing she had that mattered, the truth, said plainly, at the moment when nothing else would do. That moment was coming. The whole of the story had been moving toward it, and Clara Voss, who was patient and honest and entirely without illusion about her own position in the world, was the only person in Ashbourne who was in any way prepared for it. January came in sharp and hard, the kind of January that feels intentional, as though the world has decided to test whether the warmth of the previous months was genuine or merely seasonal. Clara had been at Ashbourne for 2 years and 3 months. She was senior housemaid, trusted by Mrs. Drummond with increasing responsibility, and known by the junior staff as someone who was demanding but fair, which she considered an accurate characterization and an acceptable one. She had been watching the Duke with her usual careful attention through December, and what she had seen was someone who was in better health than a year ago and who was, despite this, under more pressure than she had seen before. The London correspondence had been heavier recently. She knew this because she delivered it, and she could tell from the quality of the weight in the envelopes, and from the postmarks, and from the frequency, that something was building in the financial world that the estate was connected to. She did not know the details. The details were not her business. But she knew the effect of them, and the effect was visible in the tightness around his eyes and the way he moved through the house in December, faster than usual, with less of the tentative ease that had been developing over the past year. Whatever was coming from London, it was not good. She mentioned it to Mrs. Drummond in late December, not to gossip but because Mrs. Drummond would need to know to manage the household appropriately. "There is increased correspondence from the city," she said. "The next few weeks may be difficult." Mrs. Drummond had already noticed. "I know," she said. "We manage as we always manage." "Yes," Clara said. "I thought it worth naming." Mrs. Drummond gave her the look she gave to things she appreciated, but did not want to make too much of. "Thank you," she said, and went back to her accounts. Clara went back to her duties, and she thought about what was coming, and she held it alongside everything else she knew about this house and this man, and she waited. In the first week of January, a large envelope arrived on a Friday morning. George brought it up with the rest of the post and mentioned at the servants' table at midday that he had never seen a packet of that size before, and that it had a London lawyer's stamp on the corner that did not look like the usual solicitor's stamp. The afternoon was very quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded things. Clara delivered the evening post at the usual time. When she entered the study, the Duke was standing at the window with his back to the door. The large envelope was on the desk, and it had been opened. The papers from inside it were spread across the surface in a way that suggested they had been reviewed with considerable haste and then set down. She set the rest of the post on the nearest clear corner and turned to go. "Miss Voss," he said, without turning from the window. "Yes," she said. "You have been in this house for 2 years. 2 years and 3 months, she said. "In that time," he said, still looking at the garden below, "have you ever had occasion to regret taking this position?" It was an unusual question. She considered it honestly. "No," she said. "Why not?" She thought about this. "Because the work is real and the house is real, and what I do here matters," she said. "And because I have found, in this time, that I was right to trust my instincts about it." He was quiet for a moment. "Your instincts," he said. "Yes." She waited. "I have been told," he said, "by my solicitors in London, that the investment I committed to in good faith 3 years ago has collapsed. Entirely. It is not the largest sum I have ever lost, but it is not small." A pause. "It is also not the sum itself that concerns me most." "What concerns you most?" she asked, and she asked it the way she asked most things, directly, without softening it into something that had less actual content. He turned from the window then. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something entirely unguarded, something that was closest to what she had seen on the anniversary evenings but different, less controlled. He looked like a man who had spent a long time being very certain about his own capacities and had just received information that required him to revise that certainty. "I made the decision without adequate information," he said. "I trusted someone I should not have trusted. I was taken advantage of, and I did not see it coming." He paused. "I have managed this estate for 22 years. I have never before been taken advantage of." "Then perhaps," Clara said, "this is the first time you have had to manage it." He looked at her. "Being taken advantage of," she said, "managing the aftermath of it, rather than the situation itself, they are different challenges." He was still looking at her. "Yes," he said slowly, "they are." The first requires judgment about people, she said. The second requires judgment about what to do after you discover your judgment was wrong. The second is harder, because it requires accepting that you were wrong. Silence, the fire, the dark window behind him. That is, he said quietly, precisely what I am struggling with. She did not say anything else. She had said what was true, and she had said it clearly, and saying more would have added nothing. She stood in the room for a moment, not filling the silence but not fleeing from it either, and then she said good evening and left. She did not know what the following weeks would bring. She knew they would be hard. She knew the anger would likely come back, and come back badly, because this kind of thing, this kind of failure, was exactly the sort of event that drove him to the worst of it. She had 2 years of observation to tell her this. What she also had was something she had not had 2 years ago. She had the full picture. She had the understanding of where his anger lived, and what it was made of, and what it was protecting. She had the library of small moments, of conversations and observations and evenings and anniversaries that amounted to a real knowledge of this man. When the moment came, she would have what she needed. She did not plan for it. She did not rehearse. She simply went back to her work and her steadiness and her patience, and she trusted that when the time required something of her, she would know what it was. She had been right about a great many things at Ashbourne. She was, she believed, right about this too. The weeks that followed were the hardest Clara had experienced at Ashbourne. She had expected difficulty. She had known it was coming, had read it in the quality of the silences and in the weight of the London correspondence, and in the way the Duke moved through the house in the days following that January evening. She had prepared herself, as much as a person can prepare for something they cannot exactly predict, by setting aside everything except her steadiness and her honesty and the 2 years of understanding she had accumulated. But she had not fully anticipated how bad it would get, or how many different forms the badness would take. The first week of February brought 3 separate incidents. On Monday, a footman from the village who had been hired temporarily to help with some estate work was dismissed on the spot, following a minor error with a feed store door that the Duke had discovered at 7 in the morning. The dismissal was disproportionate, and everyone in the household knew it, and the temporary footman left looking stunned rather than ashamed. On Wednesday, a merchant from Wenbury who had come to deliver supplies was kept waiting in the cold entrance hall for 45 minutes, before being told that the order was reduced, and he should invoice only for what had been taken. On Friday, the post arrived and the Duke did not come to dinner. He did not come to dinner the following Friday either. Mrs. Drummond managed the practical aspects of these situations with her usual competence. She paid the temporary footman a week's extra wages from the household fund, without authorization and without discussion, because it was the right thing to do, and she had been doing right things in this house for 14 years without always waiting for authorization. She sent a note to the merchant with a more detailed invoice schedule and a better explanation of the reduced order. She had Bertha keep the dinner warm on the second Friday, and then quietly disposed of it when it was clear he was not coming. Clara managed what she could manage, which was the household itself, making sure that the junior staff were not too unsettled, making sure the routines continued, making sure that the practical running of Ashbourne did not show the cracks that were forming in its center. This was the work she could do, and she did it thoroughly. What she could not do was what she wanted to do, which was go to the study and say, directly and without preamble, that what was happening was not acceptable and that it needed to stop. She could not do this because it was not her place, and the time was not right. She knew the difference between the right moment and the wrong one. She had waited 2 years for a moment she was not yet sure had come. But she was watchful. She was always watchful. The second week of February brought a letter that George described as the thickest he had ever carried to the study. And by Thursday of that week, the servants' hall had the quality of a house in which everyone has decided to breathe very shallowly and hope that the storm passes without a direct hit. On Thursday evening, Clara delivered the post. She knocked. She waited. She was admitted. The study was in a state she had not seen before. It was not the usual aftermath of one of the acute rages, the single broken cup or thrown papers. It was a longer kind of disorder, the accumulation of days of difficult work in a space that had not been cleaned because the occupant had not wanted anyone in it. Papers everywhere, the fire lower than it should have been, several cups from different days on different surfaces, the curtains on one side half drawn, which made the room look lopsided. The Duke was at his desk. He looked as though he had not slept well in some time. His coat was the one he had been wearing for the past 3 days, which she knew, because she had seen him in it each time she had come to the corridor. He was reading something and making notes, and when he looked up at her entry, his eyes were the eyes of a man operating on a combination of determination and the absence of adequate rest. She set the post on the clear corner of the desk without comment. "The room needs cleaning," she said. He looked at her. "I have been busy." "I can see that," she said. "The room still needs cleaning, the fire needs making up, and you need dinner, which I imagine has been kept warm." He looked as if he was about to say something sharp. She waited, entirely without visible tension, for him to either say it or not say it. He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he had been about to say did not come. "Tomorrow morning," he said finally. "About the room. I am not finished in here tonight." "Tomorrow morning," she agreed. "I will come at 7. She was at the door. "Miss Voss," he said. She turned. "Has anyone mentioned to you that you are an unusually forward housemaid?" he said. It was not warm, exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the dry, flat tone he used when he was capable of an almost joke, which was not often, and which she had come to recognize as one of the only signs of genuine ease that he ever showed. "Once or twice," she said. "Good evening." She went to the kitchen and told Bertha that the Duke would be down for dinner in half an hour, and would she warm it? And Bertha looked at her with an expression that mingled relief with exasperation, and said of course she would. He was down in 40 minutes. He ate most of the meal. He did not speak to anyone, but he was there, which was itself a thing. The following Friday, which was the Friday she had been quietly dreading since January, was the worst day Ashbourne had seen in 2 years. The reports from London arrived in the Morning Post. George, who had been doing the post run that day because Clara had been occupied with a household problem in the upper floor, came back to the servants' hall looking as though he had walked through something unpleasant and not yet fully emerged from it. "Bad?" Clara asked. "Very bad," he said. "I could hear him from the corridor before I knocked." She was already on her way up the stairs. Mrs. Drummond intercepted her at the top. "Leave it," she said. "Give it time." "How much time?" Clara asked. "An hour. Maybe 2. Clara looked at the closed door of the study at the end of the corridor. From behind it came no sounds now, which was almost worse than the sounds that had preceded the current silence. "I will wait," she said. She did not wait an hour. She waited 20 minutes, because 20 minutes was what her instinct told her was right, and her instincts in this house had been reliable. She did not knock. She simply opened the door. He was standing in the center of the room. The London reports were on the floor in pieces, not torn deliberately but with the force of a man who had thrown them. 2 of the cups from previous days had been removed from the desk to the floor, with what appeared to be a single sweep of his arm. The ink from the overturned inkwell on his desk was running slowly across the leather surface. He wheeled toward her when she came in, and his face was the face of a man who has lost all the careful layers he had been building and is standing in the raw state below them. The anger was there, and the exhaustion, and underneath both of them, like the root beneath the weed, the grief, present and enormous, and having nowhere to go. She did not step back. She crossed the room. She set the tea tray on the side table by the window, which she had brought up without knowing she was going to bring it, an instinct rather than a plan. And she turned to face him. He was looking at her with the full force of everything he was feeling, and it was considerable, and he was about to direct all of it somewhere, and the somewhere that was available was her. She met his eyes. She did not look afraid, because she was not afraid. She was not afraid of him. She had never been afraid of him. She had understood him too well and too long for fear, because fear is partly born of the unknown, and there was very little about this man that was unknown to her now. She looked at him steadily, and she said the thing that 2 years had given her. "She would hate to see you suffer like this." The silence that followed those 9 words was unlike any silence Clara had ever stood inside. It was not the silence after a storm, which carries the echo of what has just passed and the slow settling of disrupted air. It was not the silence of ordinary rooms, which is merely the absence of noise. It was a specific and absolute silence, the kind that comes when something true has been said in a space that has not heard truth for a very long time, and the walls themselves seem to absorb it, to take it in and hold it. He stood very still. His face, which had been open with everything that had been building in him for days, went through something that she had never seen on it before. It was not collapse, not exactly, because the word collapse implies a loss of structure, and what happened to him was almost the reverse. It was more like the moment when a locked door is finally opened from the inside, when the thing that has been holding everything in place gives way not under external pressure but from within. His hand opened. The crumpled letter he had been gripping fell to the floor. He turned back to the window, slowly, with the movement of a man who needs the window, needs the distance and the sky beyond it, needs something that is not the interior of the room he has been locked inside. Clara did not move. She stood where she was. She had said what needed to be said, and she had meant it, and she was not going to retreat from it or soften it or add anything to it. It was complete. It was enough. It was, she believed, the truest thing she had ever said to another person. Because it was true. Catherine Harrogate, by everything Clara had been able to gather about her, through Bertha's careful accounts, and Henry's few and weighted observations, and the evidence of the portrait and the photograph, and the quality of absence she had left in this house, had been a woman of warmth and clarity and courage. A woman who had loved her husband enough to argue with him. A woman who had been the only person in his adult life who had looked at him clearly and remained. That woman would not have wanted this. She would not have wanted 7 years of closed rooms and driven away staff and the long self-punishment of anger. She would have wanted him to find his way back. She would have wanted him to live. Clara knew this not from information but from understanding. From 2 years of paying attention to the shape of his grief, the quality of his love, the particular texture of the loss. She had known it before she said it. She had been carrying it for a long time, waiting for the right moment, and the right moment had been this one. The silence held. He was at the window. His shoulders were different. The tight, held quality they had carried for weeks, for years, was gone. He looked, from behind, like a man who had put down something extraordinarily heavy, and was discovering that the ground beneath him was still solid. Clara moved to pour the tea. She did this quietly, without ceremony, the way she did everything. She poured 1 cup and set it on the corner of the side table nearest the window, within his reach if he turned. Then she bent to begin gathering the papers from the floor. She sorted them into an approximate order without looking at their contents, which were not her business, and placed them on the desk in a neat stack. She righted the overturned items. She did not write the inkwell, because that required a cloth and proper attention, and this was not the moment for that level of tidying. She simply cleared the worst of the disorder with the same quiet competence she brought to all physical tasks. He had not moved from the window. He was still looking at the garden below, at the dark February garden with its bare hedges and its frost-edged paths. Then, from behind, she heard a sound. It was quiet and brief, and then immediately controlled. The sound of a man who has been holding something back for a very long time, and has finally reached the limit of his capacity to hold it. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then it stopped, and the silence resumed, and his shoulders moved, once, with the visible effort of a man reasserting his composure. She continued her tidying. She did not turn. She did not offer comfort or acknowledgement, or any of the things that would have required him to be seen in a way he was not ready to be seen. She simply continued to be present and occupied, and entirely unconcerned with anything except the task in front of her. When she had done what she could do in the room, she stood, straightened, and looked at the desk. The inkwell will need attention in the morning, she said, to the room in general, rather than to him specifically. I will bring a cloth with the tea. Yes, he said. His voice was entirely different from the voice she had entered the room to. It was low and very quiet, and quite without the hard edge that was its usual quality. She moved toward the door. Miss Voss, he said. She stopped. He did not turn from the window. How long have you known? He said. His meaning was imprecise, but she understood it precisely. He was not asking about the financial reports. He was asking about everything else. She thought about this honestly. Since about 6 months in, she said. The grief, that it was the center of it. A pause. And you said nothing. It was not my place to say it before now, she said. And now? Now was different, she said. Now you needed it rather than being able to manage without it. He was quiet for a long time. She waited. She was very good at waiting. She would have liked you, he said finally. He said it simply, without sentiment, in the way he said the things he most meant, as a plain statement of fact. Clara felt something move in her chest. She did not let it show. I would have liked her, she said. From what I have gathered, she was a remarkable person. She was, he said. She was the most remarkable person I have ever known. Yes, Clara said. I believe that. She said good evening. She left the study. She walked down the corridor at her usual pace, neither fast nor slow, entirely steady, the way she had always walked through this house. At the bottom of the main stairs, Mrs. Drummond was waiting. She had a look on her face that Clara had never quite seen before, something between relief and something more complex, a recognition perhaps of something that had just changed in the house's atmosphere. Well, Mrs. Drummond said quietly. He needs to be left alone this evening, Clara said. The tea is up there. He knows it is there. Mrs. Drummond looked at her for a long moment. What did you say to him? Something that needed saying, Clara said. The housekeeper was quiet for another moment. Then she nodded, once, with the small, firm decisiveness that was her characteristic gesture of acceptance, and went back to the household accounts. Clara went to the kitchen. Bertha was at the stove and turned when she came in, and then stopped, looking at her face with the attention of a woman who knows how to read what is behind a person's expression. "Are you all right?" Bertha said. "Yes," Clara said. "Perfectly." "What happened up there?" "Nothing dramatic," Clara said, which was entirely true. He just needed someone to say something honest. Bertha looked at her for a moment, and then turned back to the stove. "And you said it." "Someone had to," Clara said. She sat at the kitchen table. The fire was warm. Outside the window, the February dark pressed close against the glass. Somewhere above her, in the quiet of the study, the tea she had poured was cooling on the side table by the window, and the Duke of Ashbourne was standing in the space left by 9 words, finding out whether the ground beneath him was still solid. She believed it was. She had believed it for some time. She had simply been waiting for the moment when he would believe it too. She sat in the kitchen with Bertha and the fire, and she did not say anything else, and the house settled around her into the kind of quiet that comes not after storms but after the thing that storms have been trying to get to all along. It was, she thought, a different kind of quiet than she had known in this house before. It was not the held breath quiet of dread. It was not the hollow quiet of avoidance. It was simply quiet, the way a room is quiet when it has finished being complicated and settled into what it actually is. She was content with that. The morning after the study came in with pale winter light through Clara's window, thin and cold and entirely without apology for the night that had preceded it. She lay in bed for exactly as long as she needed to be certain that she was ready to get up and do her work, and then she got up and did her work, because that was what she always did, and because the world did not pause to accommodate the significance of what had happened the night before. She brought the cloth to the study at 7, as she had said she would. She knocked twice, waited, and when there was no response, entered to find the room empty. The tea things from the night before had been used. The cup moved to the tray, the teapot set beside it with the neatness of a man who, in some other life, had been taught to leave spaces as he found them. The papers were still stacked on the desk as she had left them. The inkwell was still overturned. She cleaned the inkwell carefully, with the cloth and the small bottle of cleaner she had brought up for the purpose, and she put the room back to rights, and she left without ceremony. He was at breakfast. She saw this from the corridor as she went past the open dining room door, not deliberately but in the peripheral way that you take in things happening in rooms you are passing. He was seated at the table, reading the newspaper, eating what appeared to be most of a plate of eggs, and he looked like a man who had slept. Not well necessarily, but adequately, the kind of sleep that comes after the body has been carrying more than it can hold and has finally put some of it down. She did not stop. She continued down the corridor. The day proceeded as days do. There was work. There were the junior staff to manage. There were the 100 small administrative tasks that a large household requires to continue functioning. The linen counts and the supply lists and the schedules and the small emergencies. A broken latch in the north wing. A question from the kitchen about the menu for the following week. A conversation with Henry about the condition of the garden wall. She moved through all of it with her characteristic thoroughness, and she thought, while she moved, about what came next. Because something had changed the previous evening. She had known it would change things. That had been, in some sense, the point. But change is an imprecise word, and she was precise in her thinking, and she wanted to understand exactly what had changed and what had not. What had changed was that the Duke of Ashbourne had been seen, fully, honestly, in the way that he had not been seen since his wife died. He had been seen by someone who looked at him without agenda or fear or the protective deflection of professional politeness, and who had said the true thing directly. He had been reached in a place that had been unreachable for 7 years. What had not changed was the rest of it. She was still who she was. He was still who he was. The distance between their positions was real, and would remain real. She had not crossed any line. She had stood at the line, said what needed to be said across it, and returned to her side. She was clear about this. She was very clear. What she was less clear about, and what she would need to think carefully through, was what the right behavior looked like now. She could not pretend the previous evening had not happened, because it had, and she was not the kind of person who pretended things away. But she also could not treat it as a transformation of the relationship, because it had not been that either. It had been a moment, a significant moment, a real moment, but a moment. The key, she decided, was to continue being what she had always been. Steady, honest, present. Not to reach back toward what had happened and not to pull away from it, simply to continue. This was, she knew, the hardest kind of continuing. It required the same quality of patience that had brought her to that moment, but now with the added weight of having had the moment and needing to hold it without making too much of it. She was capable of this. She was fairly certain she was capable of this. The first real test came 2 days later. She was in the corridor outside the library when the Duke came down the main staircase. He was dressed for riding, which he had been doing more of in the past several months, and he was carrying his gloves, and he was moving with the purpose of a man who has somewhere to be. He saw her as he came off the last stair, and he slowed, and they came to stand a natural few feet from each other. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They had exchanged this greeting hundreds of times, but this was different from those other times, in the way that a word changes when the context around it changes. The same word, but now carrying more weight, a history behind it that had not been there before. He looked at her with an expression she was still learning, because it was new to his face. It was the expression of a man who is figuring out how to occupy a space that has recently become different, not uncomfortable exactly, but uncertain in a way that was honest rather than awkward. "I am going to the lower fields," he said. "The drainage situation." "The Wenbury drainage report came yesterday," she said. "It is on your desk. I thought it might be relevant." He nodded. "I saw it this morning. Thank you." There was a brief pause, the kind of pause that in an ordinary exchange would simply be the natural space before someone said goodbye and walked on. "Are you well?" he asked. It was a simple, direct question, and he asked it with the quality he had shown the previous evening. No armor, no performance. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He considered this, as though it were a real question that deserved a real answer. "I think I am better than I was," he said. "That is enough for a Tuesday morning," she said. Something moved across his face that was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on it, not quite reaching that, but present in the lines around his eyes, in the very slight relaxation of his jaw. "Yes," he said. "I suppose it is." He went out to the stables. She went about her work. That was how it was, in the weeks that followed. The same house, the same routines, the same work, but a different quality in the spaces between, a different quality in the exchanges that happened in corridors and at doors and in passing moments throughout the day. He was more present. That was the primary change. He had always been there, physically, but there is a difference between a man who is in a place and a man who is present in it, who actually inhabits it rather than moving through it while located somewhere else in his own mind. He began to inhabit Ashbourne again. She noticed it in the way he walked, slightly slower than before, with more of an awareness of the rooms he was moving through. She noticed it in the way he spoke to the other servants. George had come to her one afternoon with an expression of genuine bewilderment, to report that the Duke had asked him how his family in the village were doing, which was not a question he had ever asked in George's 2 years at the estate. She noticed it in the way he began to spend time in the garden again. Not just the purposeful early walks, but actual time, standing in the kitchen garden while Henry worked, or sitting on the stone bench near the old sundial in the afternoon when the weather allowed it. It was the behavior of a man who was, very slowly, beginning to let the world back in. This did not happen without cost. There were still bad days. There were still moments when the old pattern asserted itself, when the jaw set and the eyes went flat, and the voice took on the quality that everyone in the house had learned to move carefully around. There were still Fridays that required the household to reorganize itself around an atmosphere. But even the bad days were different. They were shorter. They reached their peak, and then they came back down again, and the coming back down happened faster than it had before, as though the room that had been created by that one honest sentence was a space he could find his way to, now that he knew it existed. She did not refer to that evening in the study. She had said what needed to be said, and it had been heard, and returning to it would only diminish it. The best thing she could do was continue to be what she had been, reliable and present and honest when honesty was needed, and let the rest develop at whatever pace it chose to develop. It was developing. She could see it. Not in dramatic ways, not in the ways that would have been obvious to someone who had not been watching for years, but in the small, real ways that actual change operates, through the accumulation of moments that are each slightly different from the moments before them, each carrying a little more of whatever is new, until the accumulation reaches a point where the new thing is simply who a person is. She was content to watch this. She was content to be part of it, in her quiet, steady way. She had not come to Ashbourne looking for significance, and she did not need significance now. She needed only to do her work well, and to be honest, and to remain. And the remaining was itself the thing that mattered most. March came, then April. The year moved toward spring with the usual combination of hope and cold mornings, and Ashbourne moved with it, and Clara moved with Ashbourne, and the Duke of Ashbourne moved too. slowly and with difficulty, and with the slightly bewildered air of a man who is discovering that the world is larger than the corner he had retreated to, and that the returning to it is harder and also better than he had imagined. This was not a love story. Clara knew this. She had always known it. The affection she had for this man was real, but it was the affection of a clear-eyed witness for a person they understand well, which is a kind of love but not the kind that stories are usually told about. What it was, in fact, was something rarer and perhaps more durable. It was the love of genuine honesty, the particular bond that forms between two people when one of them has been seen accurately and without judgment by the other, and when both of them have the courage to let that seeing matter. That bond had formed. She felt it. She was certain he felt it, though they would neither of them ever have used that word for it. And it was enough. It was, she thought, on a warm April evening, when she was walking back from the kitchen garden with a basket of early herbs, exactly enough. The spring deepened, and with it something loosened in the fabric of the house that had been tight for years. Clara noticed it in the way that she noticed all things, not in a single moment of revelation but through the accumulation of smaller moments, that each contained a piece of what was new. One of these moments came in early May, when the Duke asked her directly, in the corridor outside the library, whether she had read a particular book that she had mentioned in passing some weeks earlier. She had mentioned it in the context of a question about the library reorganization, a brief and entirely practical reference to the book's subject matter, but he had retained it, had returned to it, had sought her out to ask whether her reading of it had matched his own impression of it. She was surprised enough that she paused for a second before answering. Then she answered honestly, with her genuine response to the book, which was that she had found the first 100 pages slow but that by the middle section she had been unable to put it down. He said he had had the same experience, word for word, the slowness of the beginning and the grip of the middle, and they stood in the corridor for perhaps 8 minutes discussing a book that neither of them had intended to discuss with the other, and at the end of the 8 minutes the Duke said something that confirmed for Clara that this conversation had not been accidental. He said, "You have read a great deal of what is in this library." "Most of it," she said, "over the course of the past 2 years." "That is unusual," he said. "I had access, and I used it," she said. "It seemed wasteful not to." "Yes," he said. "I agree." He paused. "I would like to continue this conversation at another time, if you are willing." She was willing. She said so, simply, and without making more of it than it was, because that was always her method, and always the right one. In the weeks that followed, they talked about books. Not frequently, not at length, and always within the natural spaces of their existing routines, a few minutes in the corridor, a brief exchange when she was in the library for her duties, once a short conversation that began with a question about a volume she had recently reshelved, and continued for 20 minutes, because neither of them noticed the time passing. The conversations were genuine and specific and entirely contained within the world of the books themselves. He did not use them to discuss himself. She did not use them to observe him. They were simply two people who read carefully and were interested in what the other had found. But they were also something else. They were the most direct evidence yet that the man who had closed himself away from the world had found a way to be in the world again, at least in this very particular and limited way, and that the way had something to do with her steadiness and her honesty, and the fact that she had, 18 months earlier, said the thing that needed to be said. Mrs. Drummond noticed the conversations. She noticed everything. She said nothing about them directly, but she came to Clara one morning in the housekeeper's sitting room and offered her a substantial increase in wages, which she framed as recognition of the expanded responsibilities of the senior housemaid role, but which Clara understood to contain more than that. She accepted the increase with the same directness with which she accepted everything, said thank you, and returned to her work. June brought a visit from the Duke's nephew, a young man of 23 named Frederick, who was the son of the brother who had caused the legal difficulties several years earlier, and who arrived at Ashbourne with the careful wariness of someone who is uncertain how they will be received. He was polite and slightly anxious, with the air of someone who has heard a great deal about a place and a person, and does not quite know what to expect. What he found was an estate that was running well, and a man who was, for the first time in years, capable of being a host. The Duke was not transformed into warmth or ease. Those were not qualities that had ever been natural to him, but he was present, and civil, and capable of a kind of austere hospitality that, while not comfortable exactly, was not hostile. Frederick stayed 4 days. On his last evening, Clara was in the corridor near the drawing room where the two of them were talking after dinner, and she heard the nephew say something that she had not expected to hear. He said, "Uncle, I am glad to find you as I have. I was not certain what to expect." And the Duke said, What did you expect? And Frederick said, what we had been told, that you were unchanged. But you are changed. Something here has changed. There was a pause, during which Clara continued quietly along the corridor without slowing. Yes, the Duke said. Something has changed. She did not hear anything more, because she had moved beyond the door, but she carried those words with her, and they settled into the collection of things she had gathered over the years at Ashbourne, and they sat there quietly, asking nothing of her. Something has changed. Yes, it had. She had changed it, partly, with 9 words and 2 years of patience and the kind of honesty that most people find too costly to offer. She had offered it without expecting anything in return, because that was the only way to offer honesty without corrupting it into something else. What she had received, though she had not sought it, was this: a house that breathed differently. A man who inhabited his own life rather than enduring it. A position in this household that was based not on rank or tenure or the performance of duties, though she performed them excellently, but on something that had no formal name, the quality of being seen and trusted and honored for seeing clearly. It was enough. It was, she thought, as she went about her work in the long June evenings, a great deal more than enough. 3 years passed. This is not the place to say they passed quietly, because they did not entirely. Life is not made of quiet stretches, and Ashbourne was not exempt from the ordinary difficulties that any large estate in the north of England encounters over the course of 3 years. There was a particularly harsh winter that damaged the outbuildings and required considerable repair. There was a difficult season for the home farm, which put pressure on the estate's finances. There was a situation with a neighboring family whose dispute over a shared boundary took the better part of 18 months to resolve through legal channels. There was also, in the second of those 3 years, a time when the Duke was ill again, more seriously than the chest complaint of the first winter, and when Clara managed the household with a completeness that would have surprised her 19-year-old self, and that did not surprise the 24-year-old she had become. She had turned 24 in March of that year, quietly and without ceremony, though Bertha made a cake as she always did, and the household gathered as they always did, and the Duke, who had not acknowledged her birthday in previous years, left a small volume of poetry on the servants' hall table, with a brief note in his angular handwriting that said simply, with the directness that was entirely characteristic, that he had thought she might not have read this one, and that it was worth reading. She read it. It was worth reading. The 3 years had changed things at Ashbourne in ways that were real and visible, and that Mrs. Drummond, who was not given to sentiment or excess, occasionally described as an improvement so significant that she had almost stopped expecting it to reverse itself. The staff had stabilized. George had been with the household for 5 years now, and had relaxed into himself in a way that suggested he had finally stopped waiting for the next difficulty. Bertha had been promoted to cook in the full formal sense, with the wages that title carried. Henry continued to do what he had always done, competent and unhurried, growing slightly more silver-haired and no less necessary. 2 new housemaids had been added, younger girls who knew Ashbourne only as it was now and who would have been astonished to hear the accounts of how it had been before. They thought the Duke was stern and exacting, which was true, and occasionally intimidating, which was also true. And they were slightly in awe of Clara, who was their immediate supervisor and who managed them with the same clear-eyed, unhurried method she brought to everything. The Duke himself had changed in ways that were more difficult to describe because they were accumulated rather than sudden. The difference between a person you see daily and a person you have not seen in 3 years, only visible when you step back far enough to compare the present to the past. He was not easy. He had never been easy, and Clara had long ago stopped thinking of ease as the relevant measure. He still had the Friday difficulties, though they came less often and ended sooner. He was still not given to warmth in the ordinary sense, to the social cheerfulness that made a person comfortable to be around in a room full of people. He was still demanding in his standards and did not lower them for the sake of anyone's comfort, including his own. But he was present. He was alive in his own life in a way he had not been for the 7 years following his wife's death. He managed the estate with an engagement that went beyond the minimum required by responsibility. He had begun to see people, his tenants, his household staff, his occasional visitors, as people, actual human beings with circumstances that were worth attending to. He had also, over the course of these 3 years, become capable of saying things to Clara that she did not think he had been capable of saying to anyone since Catherine died. Not personal things, not in the romantic sense. Nothing that crossed the line she had always been careful about, but real things, honest things, the kind of things that only get said when 2 people have established, over years of steady and genuine exchange, that they can bear to hear each other's truths. He had said, one autumn evening in the library, that he had been afraid to stop being angry because he did not know what was beneath the anger, and that what was beneath it had been worse than the anger itself at first, but that he was starting to think it might eventually be better. She had said that she thought he was right. He had said, another time, in the corridor outside the study on a winter morning, that he was aware he had driven away people who had deserved better from him, and that he found this knowledge difficult. She had said that most people who caused harm were also the people who had been harmed themselves, and that awareness of the harm caused was the beginning of doing differently, and that he appeared to be doing differently. He had said, quietly, that he was trying. She had said that she could see that. These were not dramatic exchanges. They were not the climaxes of stories. They were the interior fabric of the story, the quiet moments between the notable ones that are actually the substance of what changes a person and a place. Clara understood this. She had always understood that the large moments, the sentence in the study, the anniversary evenings, the conversation in the library, were only visible at all because of the interior fabric. Without the months of careful watching and patient understanding and consistent honesty that preceded them, none of the large moments would have been possible. The large moments were simply the visible surface of what had been building underneath. In her 5th year at Ashbourne, something happened that she had not anticipated. Mrs. Drummond fell. It was a simple and terrible accident, the kind that changes the shape of a person's life in a moment. She was on the back stairs with a tray, and the step was wet from an earlier spill that had not been dried properly, and she went down hard. The doctor was called immediately. He diagnosed a badly broken ankle and the kind of fall-related complications that occur in a woman of 62, who has been on her feet in a large house for 14 years. She was not going to work again, not for months. Perhaps not ever, not in the same capacity. Clara managed everything. She did this not because she was asked to in a formal sense, but because it was what needed to be done, and she was the person best placed to do it. And she was not a person who waited to be asked when something needed doing. Mrs. Drummond had taught her that, among other things. The Duke gave her the formal title of housekeeper within the week. He did it in the brief, direct way he did most things, calling her to the study, and informing her that the role was hers with immediate effect, that her wages would reflect it, and that he had written to Mrs. Drummond to tell her that her position remained available to her should she recover sufficiently to return. Clara said thank you and asked whether there were any specific aspects of the household management he wished to change. He said no, that she should continue as she saw fit, and that he trusted her judgment. She held these words for a moment. She had waited years for him to be a person who could say that to another person and mean it. He had become that person, not easily, and not without the work of everyone in the house who had held steady through the years when holding steady was genuinely difficult. But he had become it. He was it now. She said she would try to deserve the trust, and he said, with the dry, flat tone that was his version of warmth, that she always had. She left the study and went to manage the household, which she did with the same competence and honesty she had always brought to everything, and the house moved around her with the particular efficiency of a place where the right person is in the right role. The weeks that followed Mrs. Drummond's accident were demanding in a practical sense but clarifying in another. Taking on the full weight of the household management made visible, more clearly than anything had before, how much Clara had been doing that was beyond her formal role, and how fully she had been prepared for the role she was now officially carrying. She had been preparing for it for 5 years without having that word for what she was doing. She had been learning the house, its needs and its rhythms and its difficulties, with the thoroughness of someone who intends to take care of something for a long time. She had been managing people, learning what each one needed and what each one could give, and where the gaps were that needed quiet attention. She had been managing the Duke, in the sense that anyone manages a complex and demanding situation, by understanding it deeply and responding to it honestly. All of this had been preparation. The new title simply acknowledged it formally. She visited Mrs. Drummond twice a week in the village, where she had gone to stay with her sister during her recovery. She brought household updates, which Mrs. Drummond received with the slightly pained expression of a woman who wants to be managing things herself and knows she cannot. She also brought books, because Mrs. Drummond was a reader, and being confined to a chair required reading material. And she brought, which she did not describe as such, company. The company of someone who understood what the house represented to the older woman, and who could speak about it with full knowledge, and without simplification. These visits were among the most important things she did in that period, she felt. Not because they were useful to her. They were not useful to her, except in the sense that everything that deepens your understanding of people is useful. They were important because Mrs. Drummond deserved them, Because 14 years in a house that had been difficult for most of those years warranted someone showing up with books and with knowledge and with the particular comfort of being known. The Duke asked after Mrs. Drummond. He asked Clara, in passing, whether she had visited, how the recovery was progressing, whether there was anything the estate could do to assist. Clara reported accurately each time, and he listened, and twice he arranged for something practical to be sent, firewood one time and a delivery of provisions another, without making ceremony of it, simply because he had thought of it and had the means to do it. She noted this. She noted it as the latest in a long series of evidences that the man who had driven away the temporary footman over a feed store door was genuinely different from the man he had been 5 years ago, not unrecognizably different. He was still himself, still difficult in his way, still the Duke of Ashbourne with all that entailed, but the version of himself he was inhabiting now was more complete, more connected to the world around him, more willing to see the people in his life as people, rather than as inconveniences or instruments. She had contributed to this. She had contributed significantly, she believed, though she would not have said so to anyone and did not need to say it to herself in terms that made it sound like credit she was claiming. It had been what was needed, and she had done it. That was enough. Summer came again, the 5th she had seen at Ashbourne, and it was warm and long and the gardens were good and the estate was doing well by any measure. The drainage problem in the lower fields had been resolved over the winter with investment and the advice of an engineer from Leeds, and the home farm was recovering from its difficult season, and the household was running with a smoothness that she was quietly proud of. She was 25 now, and she was housekeeper of a significant northern estate, and she had been here long enough that she could not imagine her life without Ashbourne in it, not because she was unable to imagine other lives, but because this one had become genuinely hers. The Duke had asked her, in June, whether she had any intention of leaving. He had asked it in the corridor outside the library, which was where most of their significant conversations seemed to happen, as though the library exercised some magnetic pull on their honesty with each other. He had asked it without preamble, with the directness that was entirely characteristic. "I have no plans to leave," she had said. "Good," he had said. Then, after a pause, "This house is better for having you in it." She had looked at him. He had said it the way he said everything true, simply, without decoration, as though it were merely an accurate observation and not something considerable. "I am glad to be here," she had said. "I have always been glad to be here." He had nodded, once, and continued down the corridor. She had stood for a moment in the quiet, and then followed him, at a distance, in the direction of her own duties. The rest of the summer passed with the pleasant quality of a season that asks nothing of you but to be present in it. The days were long and the house was well, and the people in it were, mostly, doing what they did best. Clara sat in the kitchen on summer evenings sometimes, when the day was done and the heat of the ovens was still warm in the air, and she drank tea with Bertha and talked about nothing in particular, the garden and the village and the ordinary small events of the week, and she felt the particular contentment of a person who has found their work and done it well, and is where they are meant to be. This was not everything, she knew that. She was 25 years old, and there were things she did not have and might never have, things that other women her age were building, families and homes of their own, and the particular life that comes with those things. She did not feel this as a loss exactly, not yet, but she held it as a real question, one she did not need to answer immediately, that she was allowed to simply hold. For now, there was Ashbourne, there was the house and the work, and the particular quality of purpose that came from doing something that genuinely mattered. There was the Duke, changed and difficult and real, and the small, honest exchanges that had become the texture of their daily life in this house. That was, she thought on an August evening with the kitchen fire and the fading summer light, enough for now. It would continue to be enough for some time. And when it was no longer enough, she would know. She would handle it with the same directness and honesty with which she handled everything else. She was very good at handling things. She had been good at it since before she came to Ashbourne, and Ashbourne had made her better. She finished her tea, washed her cup, and went to check that everything was locked and banked for the night, the way she always did, moving through the quiet rooms of the house with the ease of a person who knows exactly where they are. September brought the anniversary again. The 8th. Each year it had a slightly different quality, the first one she had observed having the frozen, held-breath quality of something that was still entirely raw, the subsequent ones changing incrementally, losing some of the sharp edge while never becoming ordinary or comfortable. This year, on the evening of the 3rd, she delivered the post and found him not at the desk and not at the window but in the armchair by the fire, reading, or holding a book open at least, with the photograph on the small table beside him. She set the post on the desk and turned to leave. Miss Voss, he said. He still used the formal address. She had never asked him to change it. Yes, she said. Sit down, he said. She was surprised. She did not show it. She took the chair on the opposite side of the fireplace and sat in it with the same composure she would have brought to any chair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have been thinking about something you said to me. She waited, because it was not always clear which thing he meant, given the years. That the length of time does not change the reality of it, he said. She remembered saying it. Yes, she said. I have been thinking that this is also true in the positive sense, he said. That if something was real, the time does not change that either. The reality persists. She understood what he meant. Yes, she said. I believe that is true. He looked at the photograph on the table. She was real, he said. What we had was real. I spent a long time treating it as something that had been taken from me. But it cannot be taken. It is still real. It will always have been real. Clara looked at the fire. That is, she said quietly, a significant thing to understand. It took 8 years, he said, with the dry flatness that was his version of irony. Some things take as long as they take, she said. He was quiet again. Then, unexpectedly, he said, Thank you. She looked at him. He was still looking at the photograph and he said it simply, without elaboration or explanation, because he was a man who did not elaborate or explain, and they both understood what the thank you contained. You are welcome, she said, and she meant it with the full weight of everything she had seen and done in this house. She stayed by the fire for a few more minutes, because he had asked her to sit and she would not leave before it was right to leave. Then she said good evening, and he said good evening, and she left the study and walked down the corridor and down the stairs and back into the running of the house she had been managing for the past 5 years. It was, she thought, a good evening. The years continued, as years do, with their mixture of ordinary days and the occasional day that stands out from the ordinary by virtue of being different in some way that only becomes fully visible in retrospect. Clara had been at Ashbourne for 7 years when the estate began to be talked about differently in the surrounding countryside. This was not something she orchestrated or planned. It was simply what happened when a place was genuinely well managed and the person at its center was genuinely engaged with it. People noticed. The land agent mentioned it to the Duke with the slightly careful tone of a man conveying good news he is not sure how it will be received. A neighboring estate owner commented, at a small gathering in the village that the Duke had actually attended, that Ashbourne seemed to have found its feet again. The Duke had received these observations with his characteristic level flatness, neither encouraging them nor dismissing them. But later that evening, when Clara happened to pass the library and saw him sitting in his chair with the look of a man who has had a quiet and satisfying piece of news, and is sitting with it privately, she thought that the observations had landed somewhere that mattered. She did not say anything. She moved on. She was 27 now. She had been housekeeper in the full formal sense for 2 years. She managed a household of 11 people, a number that had grown steadily as the estate's improved management had made it possible to add positions that had gone unfilled for years during the difficult period. She had also, in these years, developed something she had not had before at Ashbourne, a life outside of it, not a departure from it. She was not ready for that and might never be, but the beginnings of a dimension to her existence that was not entirely contained within the estate's walls. She had made a friend in the village, a schoolteacher named Dorothy, who was intelligent and practical, and who had been curious about Clara since hearing descriptions of her from various village residents who had reason to interact with Ashbourne. Dorothy was an excellent friend in the way that certain kinds of people make excellent friends, not by being easy or uncomplicated, but by being genuinely themselves, and by being curious about whoever they were with. She and Clara had long conversations on the evenings when Clara had time away from the estate, conversations about books and about the village and about the larger world, which was changing rapidly in ways that both of them watched with the attentive interest of people who believed it mattered to understand the world you were living in. Clara had told Dorothy about Ashbourne in general terms, and Dorothy had listened with the attention she gave everything, and had eventually said something that Clara had turned over many times afterward. You have built something real in that house, Dorothy had said. I have done my job, Clara had said. Those are sometimes the same thing, Dorothy had said, but not always. And in your case, from what you have described, they are very much the same thing. You have built something real. Clara had thought about this. I am not sure it is mine to claim, she had said. You can build something and not own it, Dorothy had said. The building is still real. This had been, Clara decided, an accurate observation, and she filed it alongside the other accurate observations she had collected over the years. The Duke had noticed, in the way he noticed everything, that she was leaving the estate more often in the evenings. He had not commented on it directly. He had simply, on one occasion, asked whether her new routine was manageable alongside her household responsibilities, with the tone of a man who was asking about the logistics while actually asking about the person. She had said it was entirely manageable, and he had said good, and that had been the extent of the conversation about it. But it had been enough for her to understand that he was not indifferent to the question of her life outside Ashbourne, which was a thing she had not been certain of before. She had thought about him, over the years, in the way that you think about someone you know very well, and who occupies a significant portion of your daily reality. She had thought about the changes in him, about the long and difficult process by which he had become the person he was now, and about the particular kind of courage it required to come back from the place he had been. She admired this, quietly and without the kind of admiration that demands expression. She had also, which she had acknowledged to herself with the usual directness she brought to her own interior, developed something for him that was more than professional regard, and less than what would have been appropriate to act on. It was a kind of love, the kind that grows from long and close knowledge of a person. It was entirely contained. She had no intention of doing anything with it, because doing something with it would have required crossing a line that the whole structure of her life at Ashbourne was built around not crossing. But she allowed herself to know it was there, because denying it would have been a kind of dishonesty, and she was not in the habit of being dishonest with herself. It was in the 8th year that the question of the future became real, in a way it had not been before. Mrs. Drummond returned, not to her full former role, which her health would not have sustained, but to a reduced and consultative position that the Duke had offered, and that she had accepted with the particular relief of a woman who had worried she was finished and discovered she was not. She came in twice a week and sat with Clara, and reviewed the household accounts and offered the kind of experience-based wisdom that comes only from having managed something complicated for a very long time. These sessions were among the most useful things in Clara's week. Mrs. Drummond knew things about Ashbourne, about its history and its difficulties and its particular requirements, that no document recorded and that would have been lost entirely without the transmission from one person to another. Clara received this knowledge the way she received all knowledge, carefully and with full attention. Mrs. Drummond, for her part, told her once, in the autumn of the 8th year, that she had never expected the house to be what it was now. "What did you expect?" Clara asked. "I expected to manage a difficult situation until I was no longer able to manage it," Mrs. Drummond said, "and to leave it still a difficult situation." She paused. "That is not what happened." "No," Clara agreed. "You happened," Mrs. Drummond said. She said it without sentiment, as a plain statement of cause and effect. Clara thought about this for a moment. "Many people happened," she said. "You stayed for 14 years when most people would have left. That matters." "I stayed because I am stubborn," Mrs. Drummond said. "Stubbornness and fidelity are sometimes the same thing," Clara said. Mrs. Drummond looked at her with the expression she had always used for things that were accurate and that she would rather not have been beaten to saying herself. "Yes," she said, "sometimes they are." The autumn that year was golden and long, the kind that makes the north of England look like something painted by someone who loved it. The estate moved through the harvest and the preparations for winter with the smooth efficiency of a well-run place, and Clara moved through the estate with the ease of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and why it matters. She was 27 years old, and she had been at Ashbourne for 8 years, and she had built something real, as Dorothy had said, and the building was still real. Whatever came next, the building would remain. Winter arrived and wrapped itself around Ashbourne with the authority of a season that knows it has the longest claim on this part of England, and the house settled into its winter rhythms, the earlier fires and the later dawns and the particular companionship of a household that has to keep warm together. Clara had begun, in the past year, to think more seriously about the future, not because she was unhappy in the present, she was not, but because thinking about the future was something responsible adults did, and she had always been responsible, and she was increasingly aware that she was building a life rather than simply occupying a position. What she was building was good. It was real, as Dorothy had said. It was work she was genuinely good at, with people she genuinely cared for, in a place that had become part of her in a way that was difficult to separate from who she was. But it was also, she acknowledged to herself honestly, a life that was very much centered on one person who was not her, and on one house that was not hers. And at some point this would require thinking about clearly. She did not think about it with anxiety. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, with the patient, observational attention that was her characteristic mode, noting what was true and what was unknown, and what required more information before any conclusions could be drawn. What was true was that she was 27.5 years old, that she had been the housekeeper of Ashbourne for 2.5 years, that she was respected and trusted and paid well, and that the work gave her genuine satisfaction. What was also true was that she had not yet settled the question of what her life was building toward, in the larger sense. She had the cottage in the village, a small one she had taken on a long lease a year earlier, partly because a housekeeper having her own space outside the estate was simply sensible and proper, and partly because she had reached the point where she needed, sometimes, to be in a space that was entirely her own. She spent 2 or 3 evenings a week there, reading and thinking and having Dorothy to supper on Thursdays. She was not lonely. She had, at Ashbourne and in the village, more genuine connection with people than many people she knew had. She had Mrs. Drummond and Bertha and the household, and she had Dorothy, and she had the particular quality of knowing herself well, which is itself a form of company. But she was aware, in the way that 27-year-old women with good minds and honest natures are aware, that there were dimensions of life she had not yet explored, and that the exploring of them would require, at some point, stepping beyond the particular contained world of Ashbourne. She was not ready to do that yet, but she was beginning to see that she might be ready someday, and that someday was not as distant as it had once seemed. The new year came, her 9th at Ashbourne, and with it the particular clarity that cold January mornings in this particular valley always brought. She walked to the kitchen garden early on the first morning of the year and stood in the frost-edged space between the bean rows and the leek beds and looked at the estate around her, the stone house with its lit windows, the stables where Patrick was already moving about, the lane that led down to the gate and the road and the village beyond. She had come here at 19 with a borrowed carpet bag and the firm intention of being good at her work. She had been good at her work. She had been good at a great deal more than her work, as it happened, though she would not have used that language about herself. What she had done was see someone clearly and say the true thing, when the true thing needed saying. That was the center of it. Everything else had grown from that, the promotions and the trust and the long accumulation of genuine understanding between herself and the man who ran this estate, and the gradual transformation of Ashbourne from a household that held its breath to one that breathed freely. She had not done this because she had planned to. She had done it because she was the kind of person who could not help but see clearly, and because she was the kind of person who could not help but say the true thing when the true thing needed saying, even at cost, even at risk, even when it would have been easier and safer to simply leave the room. 9 words. She had said 9 words at the right moment, and those 9 words had been the visible surface of 2 years of careful attention and patient understanding and the kind of honesty that requires both courage and care to deploy correctly. She had been the right person, in the right place at the right moment. She had known what to say because she had taken the time to understand what needed to be said. She had said it because she was the kind of person who did not leave the room when saying the true thing required staying in it. This was who she was. It had always been who she was. Ashbourne had not made her this. It had simply provided the conditions in which who she was could become fully visible. She stood in the kitchen garden for a while longer, in the cold January morning, looking at the house that had become, in every way that mattered, hers. Then she turned and went inside, and began the day. The 9th year was, in many ways, the fullest she had known at Ashbourne. Not because of any single event or transformation. The transformations had happened gradually over the years before it, but because the accumulation of everything that had changed had reached a point where it was simply the nature of the place, rather than the exception to what the place had always been. Ashbourne was a working estate again, in the full sense. The tenants were, for the most part, doing well. The home farm was productive. The household was stable. The Duke was engaged with the management of all of it in a way that went beyond mere duty, that had the quality of actual investment, of a person who cares about what they are doing and why. And the Duke was, in the 9th year, someone she could describe without reservation as a man who had found his way back to himself. She did not say this to anyone. It was not the kind of thing you said aloud, partly because it would have sounded presumptuous and partly because the accuracy of it was so obvious to anyone who had been present for the before and the after that it did not need to be stated. What had happened at Ashbourne was not a miracle. It was not a story about a magical intervention or a sudden change of heart. It was a story about what happens when one person refuses to reduce another person to the worst version of themselves, and keeps refusing, patiently and honestly, through the long years it takes for that refusal to make a difference. Clara knew this. She held it without pride, because pride was not the right response to it. The right response was something closer to gratitude. Gratitude for having been placed in the right position at the right time, with the right qualities to be useful, and for having had the sense to use them. She was 28 years old and she had been at Ashbourne for 9 years, and she was the housekeeper of a well-run northern estate and the trusted presence of a changed man. These were the facts of her life. They were good facts. They were real facts. She was beginning also to understand that they were not the whole of the facts, that there was more life ahead of her than behind her, and that the more life would require, at some point, a different kind of courage than the kind she had been practicing. She was not frightened of this. She had never been frightened of the things that required courage. She had simply learned, over 9 years, to be very precise about the difference between the moment to act and the moment to wait, and she trusted herself to know the difference when it came. For now, the waiting had not ended. There was still more of it to do, still more of the particular work of this particular place and this particular time. She could feel it, the way she could always feel the shape of what was needed before she could fully see it. She went about her days. She managed the household with the thoroughness that was her nature. She had her evenings in the cottage and her Thursday suppers with Dorothy and her twice-weekly sessions with Mrs. Drummond. She delivered the post to the study in the evenings and exchanged the brief, honest exchanges that had become one of the steadiest parts of her day. She was present. She continued to be present. And the house continued around her, warm and functional and real, carrying in its stones and its rooms and its rhythms the evidence of everything that had changed in it, and of the person who had done more than anyone else to bring about that change. She had done it with 9 words, and with 2 years before the 9 words, and with 7 years after them. That was the truth of how it worked. That was the truth of how most things work, if you are patient enough, and honest enough, and willing to stay in the room. The 10th year at Ashbourne came in the way that significant years sometimes do, without announcing themselves as significant, looking on the outside exactly like the years that came before. Clara was 29. She had been housekeeper for 4 years. She had arrived at this estate with a borrowed carpet-bag and a letter of recommendation from a vicar who barely knew her, and she had stayed, and the staying had been the thing that mattered more than anything else she had done. Staying was not passive. It was not the absence of leaving. It was, when the place you were staying in was genuinely difficult, a daily and active choice, the choice to remain and to remain honestly, and to not let the difficulty make you smaller than you actually were. She had made that choice, every day, for 9 years. And the 10th year was the year she began to feel, for the first time, that the choice she needed to make was a different one. It came slowly, the way most real things came to her, not as a sudden dissatisfaction or a desire to escape, nothing so simple as that. It came as a kind of fullness, the sense that what had been growing in her over 9 years had reached its natural extent, that the space she occupied at Ashbourne, however real and however good, was the full size of what this particular space could hold. She was not unhappy. She was not ready to leave, but she was aware that the question of her future, which she had been holding patiently for years, was beginning to require an answer. She thought about it in the way she thought about all significant things, carefully and without hurrying, turning it over in her mind and looking at it from multiple angles, noting what was true and what she did not yet know. What she knew was that she had a life here that was good and real. She knew that the household was stable enough and the Duke was changed enough that her leaving, if it came, would not undo what had been built. She knew that Mrs. Drummond, part-time and slower than she had been, was still here, and that the new staff she had trained over the years were capable and steady. The house would continue. The work she had done would hold. She also knew that Dorothy had been offered a position at a school in York and had taken it, and that the specific quality of her friendship with Dorothy, which had been one of the most sustaining parts of her life outside Ashbourne, would require effort to maintain across distance. She knew that the village she had come to know over 9 years was a good village but a small one, and that she was beginning to feel the smallness. She knew that she was 29 years old, and that 29, while not old in the way she had sometimes feared it might feel, was old enough to require honesty about what she was doing and why. She did not have clear answers to any of these things. What she had was the same patient, attending quality she had always had, and the understanding that the answers would come if she continued to pay attention rather than forcing them. The spring of the 10th year was late and then suddenly generous, the way the best springs are, and the kitchen garden exploded into itself with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting. Clara walked through it on a morning in April when the air smelled of turned earth and blossom from the apple trees in the corner, and she thought about what staying meant, and what going meant, and what the difference was. She was still thinking about it when the Duke appeared at the edge of the garden. He came from the direction of the stables, wearing his riding coat and carrying his gloves in a way that suggested he had just returned rather than just departed. He stopped when he saw her, which was not unusual. They had had 100 conversations that began with this small mutual pause. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He came to stand near her, looking at the garden with the considering look he brought to things he wanted to understand properly. The beans are doing well. They are, she said. Henry put them in early. He thought the soil was ready. He was right. A pause. How long have you been considering leaving? She looked at him. He was still looking at the garden. How do you know I have been considering it? She said. Because I know how you look when you are thinking about something important, he said. And you have been looking like that for several weeks. She was quiet for a moment. You are observant, she said. I have learned it from watching someone who is very good at it, he said, and she understood what he meant. I am not decided, she said. I am thinking. What are you thinking about? She considered how much to say and decided, as she had always decided in this particular space, to say the full truth. Whether I have done what I came here to do, she said. And if so, what comes next? He was quiet. The garden was very still in the April morning, the only sound the birds in the apple trees and the far-off sound of Patrick in the stables. Have you done what you came here to do? He asked. I think so, she said. Most of it. Then what do you imagine comes next? I am not entirely sure, she said. That is part of the thinking. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, and he said it in the way he said the things he most meant, simply and without decoration. Whatever you decide, you should know that what you have done here is not nothing. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden still, with the expression she had come to know so well over 9 years, the careful exterior that held more than it showed. I know that, she said. It is remarkable, actually, he said. What you have done. He paused. In the way that things that are done quietly and over a long time are always more remarkable than things that are done loudly and quickly. Bertha would like to hear that you have said so, she said. She has been doing things quietly and over a long time in that kitchen for years. Something moved across his face that was closest to a smile. Yes, he said. I should tell her. You should, Clara said. They stood in the garden for a while longer, the two of them, in the April morning, not speaking, which was a comfort now rather than a question. She had known this man for 9 years. She had known him when he was the worst of himself and when he was finding his way to the best of himself, and she had found, over all of that time, that she was genuinely glad to have known him. That was a good thing to be able to say about someone. It was not a small thing. The question of what came next remained open. She would continue to think about it with her usual patience, and she would eventually know what to do, and she would do it with the same honesty and directness she had brought to everything at Ashbourne. For now she was here, in the garden, in the April morning, with 9 years of real work behind her and whatever was coming next still forming itself in the distance, not yet visible enough to name. She was all right with this. She had always been all right with this, with the not yet visible, with the patience required by the space between understanding and action. She had been all right with it since before she came to Ashbourne, but Ashbourne had deepened it, made it richer and more certain. She turned to go inside and start the day. Miss Voss, he said. She turned. He was looking at her directly now, with the full, unguarded attention he had learned, slowly and with difficulty, to offer. Thank you, he said, for the whole of it. She understood that he meant the whole of it, the 9 years and the difficult years and the moment in the study with the tea and the 9 words and everything that had come after, the long, quiet, steady work of staying and seeing and saying the true thing. Thank you, she said, for letting it matter. He nodded, once, with the small and deliberate movement that was his version of the things other people said at length. She went inside. The house was warm around her, lit and running and real, and it smelled of bread from the kitchen and coal from the morning fires and the old stone that was the base note of everything at Ashbourne. She moved through it with the ease of a person who knows exactly where they are. She had come here with nothing much. She had stayed, and been honest, and paid attention. She had said 9 words at the right moment, with the full weight of 2 years behind them. And she had watched what those 9 words, and the years before and after them, had built. She did not know what she would do next, but she knew who she was. She had always known, and Ashbourne had made it clearer. She was the kind of person who stays in the room. She was the kind of person who says the true thing. She was the kind of person who sees you clearly and tells you what they see, not cruelly, not gently to the point of uselessness, but honestly, with the kind of care that only comes from real understanding. These were not small qualities. They had not been small at Ashbourne, and they would not be small wherever she went next. She walked to the kitchen to begin the morning, and the house moved around her with its familiar rhythms, and she was, for the moment, entirely where she was. That was, she thought, exactly enough. The afternoon of that same day brought a practical reminder that life does not pause for reflection. The supply delivery from the Wenberry merchant was late, which caused a small adjustment to the kitchen schedule that Bertha navigated with her characteristic combination of competence and complaint. One of the newer housemaids had misunderstood an instruction about the upper floor windows and opened rather than cleaned the ones that faced north, letting in a rush of cool April air that required immediate correction. Henry reported a section of garden wall that needed attention before the weight of the climbing roses on it caused a section to come down. Clara addressed all of these things in order, clearly and without drama, and by 3 in the afternoon the household was running smoothly again, and she was at her desk in the housekeeper's room with the week's accounts. This was also the life. The not dramatic, the correctable, the ordinary forward motion of a day in a large house. She had loved this part of it from early on, the satisfaction of problems that had solutions, of tasks that could be completed, of a day that ended with more things right than had been right at the start of it. She had been thinking, since the garden conversation that morning, about what the Duke had said, the full of it, meaning the whole 9 years. She turned it over with the care she gave to things that were genuine, and that she wanted to understand properly rather than quickly. He had been thanking her not just for the 9 words, though those were the hinge point of everything. He had been thanking her for the years of presence, the patient attention, the honesty that had not come and gone but had been a constant. He was thanking her, she understood, for having decided to stay. She had made that decision many times, over the years. Every time she might have left, every time the difficulty had been enough to make leaving reasonable, she had made the decision again. Not dramatically, not with any awareness that she was making a consequential choice. She had simply looked at what was in front of her and known that she was not finished here, and she had stayed another day. The accumulation of those days was what had made the difference. The sentence in the study had been the most visible moment, but without the years that preceded it, it would have been nothing, just a forward young housemaid saying something inappropriate to a man who was beyond reaching. It had worked, because the years had made it possible. The years had been the work. She had done the work. She was glad she had done it. Mrs. Drummond arrived at 4 for her twice-weekly session, slightly later than usual, having walked from the village and found the road more difficult than she had expected. She came into the housekeeper's room with her cane and her careful movements and the ever-present sense of a woman managing a body that was no longer quite as reliable as it had once been, and sat down across from Clara, with the contained relief of someone whose legs are glad to stop. "The road wants attention," she said. "I will ask Henry about the worst of it," Clara said. "The bit near the Perkins farm," Mrs. Drummond said. "The drainage has never been right there, and it gets bad in wet weather. I will have it looked at this week." They went through the accounts. This was always the substance of the sessions, the figures and the arrangements and the practical management of the estate's domestic requirements. It had been, in the early months after Mrs. Drummond's accident, a transfer of knowledge, the older woman conveying to the younger what she had accumulated in 14 years, and what could not be written in any document. Now it was more of a conversation between equals, a mutual review, each of them contributing what they saw from their particular position. "He is different again," Mrs. Drummond said, not in relation to the accounts but in the space after them, when they sometimes talked about the house in the larger sense. "In what way?" Clara asked, though she had her own answer. "More settled," Mrs. Drummond said. "Something was resolved this spring. I can see it in the way he manages the mornings." "Yes," Clara said. "I think something was resolved." Mrs. Drummond looked at her with the look she used when she knew more than she was asking about and was deciding whether to ask. "Are you leaving?" she said. The directness of it, so like Clara's own directness, made her smile slightly. "I am thinking about it," she said. "Not decided." "If you are thinking about it," Mrs. Drummond said, "you are closer to decided than you currently know." She paused. "That is how it works with you." This was, Clara considered, accurate. "Then perhaps I am closer to decided than I currently know," she said. "What would you do?" "I am not certain," Clara said. "Something that uses what I have learned here. Something real." "Everything real uses what you have learned," Mrs. Drummond said, with the pragmatic wisdom that was her characteristic contribution to most conversations. "Yes," Clara said. "I suppose it does." She sat with this through the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, while she went about the last tasks of the day and checked that everything was as it should be, before the household settled into its night rhythms. She checked the fires, checked the locks, confirmed with the night staff what needed to happen before morning. She walked through the rooms she had walked through 1,000 times, with the knowledge of each one that comes only from years of daily presence. The dining room with its portraits and its long table that had once seen so many silent, difficult meals and now saw meals that were at least peaceful, The library with its thousands of books in their not quite logical order that she knew by heart. The corridor outside the study where she had stood on that Friday evening in February, holding a tea tray, with 9 years of her life running toward a single moment that she had not planned and had not rehearsed. She stood there now, in the corridor, in the evening quiet. The study door was closed. She could hear nothing from behind it, which meant the Duke was reading, or sitting with his own thoughts in the way he had learned to sit with them, without the anger, without the thrown things, without the pressure that used to fill a room from the outside of the door. She did not knock. There was nothing to bring him tonight. She was simply there, for a moment, in the corridor that had been the scene of so much of this story. She thought about what she would take with her when she eventually left. Not objects, she owned little that was not already hers. She would take knowledge, a deep and specific knowledge of how a large household runs and what it requires, of how to manage people with honesty and care, of how to see situations clearly and respond to what is actually there, rather than what would be easier to see. She would take the understanding she had built about grief and anger and the relationship between them, about what people need when they are at the worst of themselves, about the particular courage that is required to say the true thing to someone who has stopped expecting to hear it. She would take the 9 years, the full 9 years, all of them, the difficult early months and the long middle years and the settled fullness of the years that followed the change. She would take all of it because all of it was hers, because she had earned it through the simple and extraordinary act of staying and being honest and paying attention. She turned from the corridor and walked back toward her own quarters, moving through the house with the ease of a person who belongs exactly where they are. Whatever came next, she would be ready for it. She was always ready for things. It was one of the facts about her that had never changed. She had walked into this house at 19 with nothing much except her capacity for clear seeing and her willingness to say what she saw. She was leaving it, whenever she left, with those same qualities and everything that 9 years of using them had built on top. The house was quiet around her. Outside, the April evening was settling into night, and the stars were beginning to appear over the valley with the unhurried regularity of things that have been doing what they do for a very long time, and intend to continue. She went to her room. She sat for a while in the small chair by the window, looking at the dark of the kitchen garden below and the deeper dark of the fields beyond it. She thought about the 19-year-old who had walked up that drive in September 9 years ago, carrying her carpet bag, already paying attention, already noting what was in front of her. That girl had been right to come here. She had been right to stay. She had been right about the 9 words, and about the years before them, and about the years that followed. She had been right about most of it, really. She got up, prepared for bed in the quiet and methodical way that was her nature, and she lay down in the small room she had occupied for 9 years, and she felt the house settle around her into the night. She was glad for all of it, even the difficult parts. Maybe especially the difficult parts, because those were the parts that had required her to be most fully herself, and being fully yourself was the only way to do anything that actually mattered. She closed her eyes. The house was quiet. Ashbourne was quiet. And somewhere in it, the work she had done was still real, still standing, still holding. It would hold long after she was gone, the way the work of steady and honest people always holds. Not loudly, not in a way that demands notice, but solidly, the way old stone holds, through every season that comes after. That was enough. It was exactly enough.